Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Sheriff Arden Kincaid had spent 17 years patrolling the fog-drenched coastline of Coos County, Oregon, where the Pacific Ocean crashed against jagged cliffs and ancient forests stood like silent witnesses to centuries of human passage. In all those years, she had learned that the wilderness along this stretch of coast kept its secrets well, swallowing hikers who strayed from marked trails, claiming fishermen who ventured too close to unstable rock faces, and occasionally revealing bones that had been hidden for decades in the dense undergrowth. But she had never encountered anything quite like what began on a rain-soaked morning in March 2019, when a frantic call came through dispatch about 4 college students who had vanished from a popular camping area without leaving so much as a footprint behind. The call came in at 6:23 a.m., just as Kincaid was reviewing incident reports from the previous night's patrol. The voice on the other end belonged to a young man named Travis Chen, who identified himself as a University of Oregon student and explained that he had arrived at the Cape Perpetua campground to meet his girlfriend and 3 other friends, only to find their campsite abandoned in a way that made no sense. The tents were still standing, their sleeping bags laid out as if the occupants had simply stood up and walked away in the middle of the night. Cooking equipment sat beside a cold fire ring, and most disturbingly, all 4 cell phones were still inside the tents, along with wallets, car keys, and other personal belongings that no one would voluntarily leave behind. Kincaid listened carefully as Chen described the scene, noting the tremor in his voice that suggested genuine fear rather than the pranks that occasionally wasted department resources. She asked him specific questions about the timeline, learning that the group had planned a 3-day camping trip, and Chen was supposed to join them on the 2nd day after finishing a morning class. When he arrived at the designated campsite around 10 p.m. the previous evening, he found everything as he was now describing it, with no sign of his girlfriend or the others. He had spent the night in his car, assuming they had gone for a late hike and would return. But when dawn broke and they still hadn't appeared, he decided to call for help. 20 minutes later, Kincaid was navigating her patrol vehicle down Highway 101, the 2-lane road that hugged the Oregon coastline through some of the most spectacular and unforgiving terrain in the state. Dense fog rolled in from the ocean, reducing visibility to less than 100 feet and creating the disorienting sensation of driving through clouds. She had called Deputy Lyle Torrance to meet her at the campground, knowing that she would need backup if this situation was what it appeared to be. 4 missing persons in an area known for treacherous terrain and unpredictable weather. Cape Perpetua was a popular destination for tourists and locals alike, a dramatic headland rising 800 feet above the Pacific Ocean and offering hiking trails through old-growth forests that had stood for centuries. The campground sat in a protected valley a mile inland from the coastal viewpoints, surrounded by Sitka spruce and Douglas fir trees that blocked out most of the sunlight even on clear days. Kincaid had been called to this area before for minor incidents, vehicle break-ins, underage drinking citations, the occasional hiker with a twisted ankle, but never for something that carried the ominous weight of this situation. She found Travis Chen's vehicle parked at the entrance to Campsite 17, a designated spot that included a cleared area for tents, a metal fire ring, and a wooden picnic table weathered gray by years of coastal moisture. Chen himself was pacing beside his car, a thin young man in his early 20s wearing a University of Oregon sweatshirt and looking like he hadn't slept in 24 hours. As Kincaid pulled up, he immediately approached her vehicle, words spilling out in a rush of anxiety and confusion. "Thank God you're here," Chen said as Kincaid stepped out of her patrol vehicle. "I've been going crazy trying to figure out what happened. Sarah would never just leave her stuff like this. None of them would. Something's really wrong." He gestured toward the campsite behind him, where Kincaid could see 3 tents arranged in a rough semicircle around a fire ring. Even from this distance, the scene had an unsettling quality. Too neat, too undisturbed, as if the occupants had simply evaporated into the foggy morning air. Kincaid retrieved her camera and evidence kit from the vehicle, then approached Chen with the calm demeanor that came from years of dealing with emergencies. "I need you to walk me through exactly what you found when you arrived last night," she said. "Don't touch anything, just show me what you saw." Chen nodded and led her toward the campsite, his hands shaking slightly as he pointed out the details that had alarmed him. The 3 tents were still properly staked, their rain flies secured against the persistent coastal drizzle that had fallen throughout the night. Inside the nearest tent, Kincaid could see 2 sleeping bags spread out side by side, a battery-powered lantern sitting between them, and 2 backpacks propped against the tent wall. Personal items were scattered in the casual way of campers who felt secure in their surroundings: a paperback novel, a water bottle, charging cables for the phones that still lay on top of the sleeping bags. "This was Sarah's tent," Chen explained, his voice catching on his girlfriend's name. She was sharing it with Emma Rodriguez. The tent on the left was where Marcus Webb and Jake Torres were staying. He pointed to the 3rd tent, slightly larger than the others. That one had all the group's food supplies and cooking gear. Everything's still here. Their hiking boots are still inside the tents. Sheriff, they didn't even take their shoes. That detail struck Kincaid as particularly significant. The terrain around Cape Perpetua was notoriously rough, covered with exposed roots, loose rocks, and thick undergrowth that could shred unprotected feet within minutes. No one familiar with hiking would venture into this forest barefoot, especially at night. She photographed the tent interiors from multiple angles, documenting the positions of every visible item before moving to examine the fire ring. The campfire had burned down to cold ashes, suggesting it had been extinguished or simply allowed to die out many hours earlier. Kincaid knelt beside the fire ring and studied the surrounding ground carefully. The earth here was soft from recent rain, and she could see footprints in the mud around the campsite, multiple sets of boot prints that matched the hiking boots visible inside the tents. But beyond the immediate area of the campsite, the prints seemed to simply stop, as if the 4 campers had walked to the edge of their designated space and then vanished into thin air. Deputy Torrance arrived while Kincaid was examining the perimeter of the campsite, his patrol vehicle pulling in behind Chen's car. Torrance was a solid, methodical officer in his mid-30s who had grown up in Coos County and knew the coastal forests as well as anyone in the department. He approached the scene with his usual careful attention to detail, taking in the arrangement of the tents and the undisturbed quality of the site before speaking. "What are we looking at, Sheriff?" Torrance asked quietly, positioning himself so that Chen couldn't overhear their conversation. Kincaid appreciated his discretion. There was no point in speculating about worst-case scenarios in front of a frightened witness. 4 missing persons, last seen sometime yesterday afternoon, based on what Chen told me, Kincaid replied, keeping her voice low. "All their belongings are here, including phones and wallets. No signs of struggle, no blood, no indication they were forced to leave. But also no logical explanation for why they would have left voluntarily without their shoes or any of their gear." She paused, scanning the fog-shrouded forest that surrounded the campsite. Something made them leave this site in a hurry, or something made them leave in a way that didn't allow them to take anything with them. Torrance's expression grew more serious as he processed this information. "You thinking abduction?" he asked. Would take some serious coordination to grab 4 people at once without any sign of resistance. I don't know what I'm thinking yet, Kincaid admitted. But I want to expand the search perimeter and see if we can pick up any tracks beyond the immediate campsite area. Also, need to start interviewing anyone who was camping in this area yesterday or last night. Someone might have seen or heard something useful. She turned to look at Chen, who was standing near his vehicle with his arms wrapped around himself against the morning chill. And we need to get detailed information about the missing persons, full descriptions, medical conditions, their plans for this trip, any reason they might have to disappear voluntarily. Over the next hour, Kincaid and Torrance conducted a systematic search of the area surrounding Campsite 17, working in expanding circles and documenting everything they found. The forest here was typical of the Oregon coast, incredibly dense, with limited visibility beyond a few dozen feet in any direction. Sword ferns created thick ground cover between the massive tree trunks, and fallen logs covered with moss created natural barriers that made straight-line travel almost impossible. The constant drip of moisture from the canopy above created a sound like whispered voices, and the fog that drifted between the trees gave everything a dreamlike, disorienting quality. They found no additional footprints beyond the campsite perimeter, which struck Kincaid as increasingly strange. 4 people leaving an area should create some kind of trail, especially in the soft forest floor that held impressions well. It was as if the missing campers had walked to the edge of their site and then simply ceased to exist in any physical form. Torrance noticed the same absence of evidence and exchanged a troubled glance with Kincaid as they regrouped at the campsite. "This doesn't make sense," Torrance said quietly. "Even if they walked on logs or rocks to avoid leaving prints, we should see some disturbance in the vegetation. Broken ferns or displaced moss, there's nothing. It's like they floated away." He shook his head, clearly disturbed by the implications. "Sheriff, I've tracked lost hikers through these forests for 10 years. People leave traces. Always. This is different." Kincaid had to agree with his assessment, though she kept her growing unease to herself. She had Chen provide detailed descriptions of the 4 missing campers. Sarah Chen, 21 years old, 5'4" with black hair and brown eyes. Emma Rodriguez, 22, 5'6" with brown hair and hazel eyes. Marcus Webb, 23, 6 feet tall with blonde hair and blue eyes. Jake Torres, 22, 5'10" with dark brown hair and brown eyes. All were University of Oregon students in good physical health with no history of mental illness or substance abuse. According to Chen, they were experienced campers who had made this trip specifically because they loved the coastal forests and wanted a quiet place to spend spring break away from crowds. "Did any of them mention seeing anything unusual during their first day here?" Kincaid asked. "Other campers who made them uncomfortable? Strange sounds in the forest? Anything at all out of the ordinary?" Chen thought for a moment, then shook his head. "Sarah texted me around 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon. She said they'd had a great day hiking to the coastal viewpoints and were planning to cook dinner and turn in early. Everything sounded completely normal. She was excited about me joining them today." His voice broke slightly. "That was the last message I got from her." Kincaid pulled out her radio and called dispatch, requesting additional units to begin a full-scale search and rescue operation. Within an hour, the campground area was swarming with personnel from multiple agencies: Coos County Sheriff's deputies, Oregon State Police, Forest Service Rangers, and volunteer search and rescue teams familiar with the Cape Perpetua terrain. Search dogs were brought in to try to pick up the scent trails of the missing campers, but the dogs behaved strangely, refusing to leave the immediate area of the campsite and showing signs of distress that their handlers found unusual. "These dogs are trained to track in difficult conditions," explained handler Karen Briggs, a veteran of dozens of search operations in Oregon's wilderness areas. "I've never seen them refuse to pick up a scent like this. They're clearly smelling something that belonged to the missing people. I gave them items from the tents, but they won't follow any trail beyond this clearing. It's like the scent just stops. She looked troubled as she watched her German shepherd pacing nervously at the edge of the campsite, whining and pulling back toward the tents whenever Briggs tried to lead him into the forest. This isn't normal behavior, Sheriff. Something's got them spooked. By mid-afternoon, more than 50 searchers were combing the forests and coastal areas around Cape Perpetua, calling out the names of the missing campers and checking every ravine, cave, and hidden spot where someone might have fallen or taken shelter. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging flew grid patterns over the dense canopy, searching for any sign of body heat that might indicate the location of the 4 missing students. But as the hours passed and the search area expanded to cover more than 10 square miles of wilderness, no trace of Sarah Chen, Emma Rodriguez, Marcus Webb, or Jake Torres was found. Kincaid remained at the campsite, treating it as both a missing persons case and a potential crime scene until she could determine which it actually was. She had the contents of each tent carefully documented and collected, bagging the cell phones for later analysis and preserving any items that might provide clues about what had happened. The phones themselves were all powered on but locked, requiring passwords that Chen didn't know. She would need to get warrants to access them, a process that would take time even with the urgency of the situation. As evening approached and the fog grew thicker, transforming the forest into an impenetrable gray wall, Kincaid made the decision to suspend active searching until morning. The terrain was too dangerous to navigate at night, and the fog made it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Search teams were instructed to return at first light, and temporary lighting was set up around the campsite to preserve it overnight. Kincaid assigned Deputy Torrance to remain on scene, ensuring that no one disturbed the area before forensic teams could conduct a more thorough examination in the morning. Before leaving for the night, Kincaid walked the perimeter of the campsite one final time, her flashlight cutting through the fog to illuminate the massive tree trunks and dense undergrowth. The forest at night had an oppressive quality, with sounds that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The drip of moisture, the rustle of unseen animals, the distant crash of waves against coastal rocks. She tried to imagine what might have caused 4 experienced campers to leave this site without any of their belongings, but every scenario she constructed seemed to have fatal flaws. Abduction seemed unlikely without any signs of struggle. Getting lost seemed impossible when they hadn't taken their boots or any navigation equipment. A medical emergency might explain one person leaving quickly, but not all 4 simultaneously. As she stood at the edge of the campsite, staring into the fog-shrouded forest, Kincaid felt a creeping sense of unease that had nothing to do with the cold or the approaching darkness. Something about this place felt wrong in a way she couldn't quite articulate. The forest seemed too quiet, the fog too thick, the absence of any trace of the missing campers too complete. In her years of law enforcement, she had developed an instinct for when a situation was merely unfortunate and when it was actively dangerous. This situation felt dangerous, though she couldn't explain why or what the danger might be. She returned to her vehicle and began the drive back to the department headquarters in Coquille, the county seat located about 20 miles inland from the coast. The drive gave her time to think through what she knew and what she needed to do next. By now, the families of the missing students would have been notified, and she would need to conduct interviews with them to gather any information that might help explain the disappearance. She would also need to check for any similar incidents in the area. Had other campers gone missing from Cape Perpetua or nearby locations? Were there any reports of suspicious individuals or activities in the coastal forests? Back at the department, Kincaid spent several hours reviewing databases and consulting with other law enforcement agencies along the Oregon coast. What she found was both reassuring and troubling. reassuring because there were no recent reports of missing persons from the Cape Perpetua area. Whatever had happened to these 4 students seemed to be an isolated incident. Troubling because, as she expanded her search parameters to include the entire Coos County coastline, she found a pattern that she had never noticed before. Over the past 15 years, there had been 11 cases of missing persons reported from camping areas along this stretch of coast. Most had been classified as lost hikers who had presumably fallen from cliffs or been swept out to sea, their bodies never recovered. The terrain was dangerous enough that such conclusions were reasonable, even inevitable. But as Kincaid reviewed the case files, she noticed something that sent a chill down her spine. In 3 of those cases, all from the past 5 years, the missing persons had last been seen at campsites where their belongings had been left behind, just like the current situation. The first was a solo hiker named Martin Chambers, who had disappeared from a campsite near Sunset Bay in 2015. His tent had been found intact with all his gear inside, including his wallet and cell phone. The second was a married couple, David and Lisa Hernandez, who had vanished from a campsite near Shore Acres State Park in 2017. Their campsite had been found undisturbed with their vehicle, camping equipment, and personal belongings all in place. The third was a young woman named Rachel Morrison, who had disappeared from a campsite near Bandon in 2018. Like the others, her campsite had shown no signs of struggle or forced departure, just an eerie absence of the person who had been there. All 4 cases had been investigated as missing persons cases, with searches conducted and families notified, but no bodies had ever been recovered, and no evidence of foul play had been found. Eventually, the cases had been closed with the assumption that the missing persons had wandered away from their campsites and met with accidents in the treacherous coastal terrain, falling from cliffs, being swept away by rogue waves, or becoming lost in the dense forests and succumbing to exposure. But now, with 4 more people missing under nearly identical circumstances, Kincaid couldn't shake the feeling that these cases were connected by something other than coincidence. The pattern was too consistent. Campsites left undisturbed, personal belongings abandoned, no trace of the missing persons beyond the immediate area of their camps. Someone who knew these coastal forests intimately might be able to abduct people without leaving evidence, but it would require considerable skill and local knowledge. And it would require a motive that Kincaid couldn't yet identify. She printed out the case files for the previous missing persons and spread them across her desk, studying the details and looking for any connections between the victims. They varied in age from early 20s to mid-40s, included both men and women, and came from different parts of Oregon and neighboring states. None of them had known each other or had any obvious connections. The only thing they had in common was that they had all chosen to camp in isolated areas along the Coos County coastline, and they had all vanished without leaving any trace behind. As midnight approached, Kincaid was still at her desk, comparing maps of the locations where people had disappeared and trying to identify any geographic patterns. What she found was interesting. All of the disappearances had occurred within a 20-mile stretch of coastline between Cape Arago and Cape Perpetua, an area characterized by extremely dense forest, dramatic coastal topography, and limited human population. This was some of the most remote and difficult terrain on the Oregon coast, where cell phone coverage was spotty at best, and help could be hours away even in good weather. The next morning arrived with the same heavy fog that had characterized the previous day, and Kincaid returned to Cape Perpetua to oversee the continuation of the search operation. Additional resources had been mobilized overnight, including a forensic team from the Oregon State Police Crime Lab who would conduct a detailed examination of the campsite for any evidence that might have been missed in the initial search. Kincaid met with the lead forensic investigator, a methodical woman named Dr. Patricia Oakes, who had worked dozens of missing persons cases throughout the state. "I read the initial reports," Dr. Oakes said as she surveyed the campsite. This is unusual, Sheriff. 4 people don't just vanish without leaving some kind of evidence behind. We'll process everything we can, soil samples, trace evidence, anything that might tell us what happened here." She paused, studying the arrangement of the tents and the surrounding forest. "Have you considered that this might be a staged scene? That someone wanted it to look like the campers simply walked away?" The possibility had occurred to Kincaid, though she hadn't wanted to voice it without more evidence. "What makes you think it might be staged?" she asked. Dr. Oakes gestured towards the tents. "Everything's too neat. Even people who are careful campers don't usually leave their sites this organized, and the fact that personal belongings are arranged in a way that makes them easily visible, phones on top of sleeping bags, wallets laid out neatly. It feels deliberately presented, like someone wanted us to know these items were left behind." She looked troubled. "In my experience, when people leave suddenly because of an emergency or a threat, they grab things randomly. They don't carefully position their belongings for discovery." The forensic team spent the entire day processing the campsite, collecting samples and examining every inch of the area for evidence that might explain the disappearance. They found no blood, no signs of struggle, no indication that weapons had been present or that any violence had occurred. The soil samples showed nothing unusual, and fingerprint analysis of items in the tents revealed only the prints of the 4 missing campers and Travis Chen. It was as if Sarah Chen, Emma Rodriguez, Marcus Webb, and Jake Torres had simply ceased to exist between the time Chen received his girlfriend's text message at 4 p.m. and the time he arrived at the campsite at 10 p.m. Meanwhile, search teams continued to comb the surrounding forests and coastline, expanding their grid patterns to cover an increasingly large area. Helicopters flew low over the canopy, using both visual searches and thermal imaging to look for any sign of the missing students. Coast Guard vessels patrolled the shoreline, checking for bodies that might have washed up or clothing that might have been carried by ocean currents. But after 2 full days of intensive searching involving more than 100 personnel, no trace of the 4 missing campers had been found. On the 3rd day of the investigation, Kincaid decided it was time to start looking beyond the immediate area of the disappearance and focus on who might have the knowledge and opportunity to make 4 people vanish so completely. She began by interviewing other campers who had been in the Cape Perpetua area around the time of the disappearance, asking about anyone they might have seen or anything unusual they might have noticed. Most reported nothing out of the ordinary, just the typical experience of camping in Oregon's coastal forests, quiet, foggy, and isolated. But one interview proved more productive. An elderly couple named Harold and June Patterson had been camping at a site about half a mile from where the students had stayed, and they reported seeing someone unusual in the area on the afternoon before the disappearance. Harold described a woman, probably in her 50s or early 60s, who had been walking alone through the campground area carrying what looked like a naturalist's notebook and taking photographs of the forest. There was nothing inherently suspicious about this. Cape Perpetua attracted naturalists and photographers regularly, but something about the woman's behavior had stuck with Harold. She seemed very interested in who was camping where, Harold explained. "I saw her walking past our site twice, and both times she was looking at the occupied campsites more than she was looking at the forest. And when I said hello to her, just being friendly, she barely acknowledged me and kept walking. Most people on these trails are pretty sociable, especially the locals. This woman acted like she didn't want to be noticed or remembered." He paused, thinking. Also, she wasn't dressed like a typical day hiker. She had serious hiking boots, the kind you use for rough terrain, and she was carrying a large backpack that looked heavy, like she had significant supplies with her. Kincaid asked Harold to describe the woman in detail, and he provided a description of a woman approximately 5'7", with gray-brown hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing dark green hiking pants and a gray jacket. He hadn't gotten close enough to see her face clearly in the foggy conditions, but he estimated she was probably in her late 50s or early 60s based on her hair color and general appearance. June Patterson added that she had seen the same woman, or someone matching that description, walking toward the area where the students' campsite was located, though she hadn't paid much attention at the time. This was the first potentially useful lead Kincaid had uncovered, and she immediately had Deputy Torrance start checking with Forest Service rangers and campground hosts to see if anyone knew of a woman matching that description who frequented the Cape Perpetua area. The response came back within a few hours, and it provided Kincaid with her first solid direction to investigate. Several rangers and longtime volunteers in the area knew exactly who Harold Patterson had described, and the information they provided made Kincaid's instincts sharpen with recognition that this case might be more complex than a simple missing person situation. The woman was named Maeve Holleran, and she had lived in the Coos County coastal area for more than 30 years. She was known to local rangers and frequent visitors as someone who spent an unusual amount of time in the coastal forests, often camping alone for extended periods and conducting what she claimed was naturalist research. She was described as intensely private, sometimes unfriendly, and possessive of certain areas of the forest that she seemed to consider her personal territory. More significantly, several rangers mentioned that Holleran had been involved in disputes with campers and hikers over the years, accusing them of disturbing wildlife habitats and damaging sensitive forest areas. "Maeve's a bit of a character," explained Forest Service Ranger Tom Brightwell when Kincaid interviewed him at the ranger station. "She knows these forests better than anyone I've ever met, and she's passionate about protecting them. But she can be confrontational with people she thinks aren't respecting the wilderness properly. I've had to mediate a few situations where she's gotten into arguments with campers." He hesitated, then added, "She's never been violent or anything like that, but she definitely has a hostile attitude toward what she calls tourist campers who come here without proper appreciation for the environment." Kincaid asked for Holleran's address and any information about her background. What she learned was intriguing and potentially concerning. Maeve Holleran lived in an extremely remote cabin situated on private land about 15 miles south of Cape Perpetua, in an area so isolated that it required a four-wheel drive vehicle to access. She had purchased the property in 1989 and had lived there alone ever since, supporting herself through freelance naturalist photography and occasional writing for outdoor magazines. She had no criminal record, but there were numerous complaints on file from campers and hikers who had encountered her in the forests and found her behavior threatening or disturbing. One complaint from 2016 was particularly notable. A family camping near Bandon had reported that a woman matching Holleran's description had approached their campsite after dark and told them they needed to leave the area immediately because they were disrupting essential forest processes. When the family refused, the woman had allegedly stood at the edge of their campsite for hours, just watching them in silence. The family had been frightened enough to pack up and leave in the middle of the night, and they had filed a formal complaint with both the Forest Service and the Coos County Sheriff's Department. The complaint had been investigated, but no charges had been filed because there was no evidence of actual threats or illegal behavior. As Kincaid read through the various reports about Maeve Holleran, she felt her investigative instincts crystallizing around this woman as a potential person of interest in the disappearances. Holleran had the local knowledge necessary to navigate the coastal forests without leaving traces. She had a documented history of hostility toward campers. She had been seen in the area immediately before the most recent disappearance. And perhaps most significantly, her property was located within the 20-mile stretch of coastline where all of the previous disappearances had occurred. It was time to have a conversation with Maeve Holleran, but Kincaid knew she needed to approach this carefully. If Halloran was involved in the disappearances, confronting her directly might cause her to destroy evidence or simply refuse to cooperate. On the other hand, 4 people were missing, and time was critical if there was any chance they were still alive. Kincaid made the decision to visit Halloran's property with Deputy Torrance, ostensibly to ask routine questions about whether she had seen anything unusual in the area, while actually assessing whether this woman might be responsible for what had happened to the missing campers. The drive to Halloran's property took nearly an hour, following progressively smaller and rougher roads until they were navigating a rutted dirt track that wound through dense forest and across several small streams. The isolation was profound. They passed no other vehicles and saw no signs of human habitation once they left the main highway. This was exactly the kind of place where someone could operate without witnesses, where screams would never be heard and secrets could be kept indefinitely. Halloran's cabin finally came into view at the end of the track, a weathered wooden structure surrounded by towering Douglas firs and sitting in a small clearing that showed signs of careful maintenance. Smoke rose from the chimney, indicating someone was home. Kincaid and Torrance approached slowly, parking their patrol vehicle in a visible location and taking note of the property layout before proceeding toward the cabin. Several outbuildings were visible behind the main structure, and Kincaid noticed that the property was surprisingly well equipped for such a remote location. Solar panels on the cabin roof, a substantial woodpile, what looked like a generator shed, and a large workshop structure that seemed incongruous with the modest cabin. Before they could reach the front door, it opened, and Maeve Halloran stepped out onto the porch. She matched the description Harold Patterson had provided, a woman in her late 50s or early 60s with gray-brown hair, wearing practical outdoor clothing and carrying herself with a confident, almost aggressive posture. Her expression, as she looked at the 2 sheriff's deputies, was not welcoming, but neither was it particularly alarmed, which Kincaid found interesting. Most people in remote areas were either friendly toward law enforcement visitors or nervous about why police had come to their property. Halloran seemed neither, just coldly evaluative. "You're on private property," Halloran said without preamble, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "Unless you have a warrant, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave." It was not the greeting Kincaid had expected, and it immediately put her on alert. She stopped at a respectful distance from the porch and identified herself and Deputy Torrance, explaining that they were investigating the disappearance of 4 campers from Cape Perpetua and were interviewing people who might have information about unusual activity in the area. "I don't have any information," Halloran replied flatly. "I mind my own business and I expect others to do the same. Now, if there's nothing else, I have work to do." She started to turn back toward her cabin, clearly intending to dismiss them without any further conversation. Kincaid knew she needed to establish some level of cooperation without causing Halloran to completely shut down. "Ms. Halloran, 4 people are missing, and their families are desperate for any information that might help us find them," Kincaid said, keeping her tone professional but firm. "We understand you spend a lot of time in the coastal forests and know the area extremely well. Even if you didn't see anything specific, your knowledge of the terrain might help us focus our search efforts more effectively. We're just asking for a few minutes of your time." Halloran turned back to face them, and her expression was unreadable. She seemed to be weighing something in her mind, calculating whether cooperation or continued resistance would serve her interests better. Finally, she descended from the porch and approached to within about 10 feet of where Kincaid and Torrance stood, though she maintained a careful distance that kept her out of easy reach. Up close, Kincaid could see that Halloran was probably stronger than her age might suggest, with the lean, muscled build of someone who spent most of their time doing physical labor outdoors. "What do you want to know?" Halloran asked, her tone suggesting that she was granting a favor rather than cooperating with a law enforcement investigation. Kincaid ran through the basic questions. Had Halloran been in the Cape Perpetua area 2 days ago? Had she seen the 4 missing campers, or noticed anything unusual? Did she have any theories about what might have happened to them? To each question, Halloran provided minimal responses. Yes, she had been hiking in that area. No, she hadn't specifically noticed the 4 campers Kincaid described. No, she had no idea what might have happened to them. The answers were technically cooperative, but devoid of useful information. Deputy Torrance tried a different approach. Ms. Halloran, we've heard from several people that you're very protective of these forests, and sometimes confront campers you think aren't being respectful of the environment. Did you have any interactions with campers at Cape Perpetua that day? It was a more direct question that bordered on accusation, and Kincaid saw Halloran's expression harden in response. I speak to people when I think they're damaging sensitive areas, Halloran said coldly. That's not a crime. If you're suggesting I had anything to do with these missing people, you're wasting your time and theirs. I live alone out here because I don't like most people, but I've never hurt anyone. She paused, and something flickered in her expression that Kincaid couldn't quite read. The forests around here can be dangerous for people who don't know what they're doing. Easy to get lost, easy to fall, easy to disappear. Maybe those campers just learned that lesson the hard way. There was something in the way Halloran said those last words that made Kincaid's instincts spike with warning. It wasn't quite a confession, and it wasn't quite a threat, but it carried an undercurrent of knowledge that seemed significant. Before Kincaid could press further, Halloran stepped back and announced that she had answered enough questions and wanted them to leave her property. Kincaid knew she couldn't force the issue without probable cause to detain or arrest Halloran, so she thanked the woman for her time and walked back to the patrol vehicle with Torrance. As they drove away from the isolated cabin, Torrance voiced what Kincaid was thinking. She knows something, Sheriff. I'd bet my badge on it. The way she talked about the forests being dangerous, and that comment about people disappearing, that wasn't random. She was telling us something without actually telling us. Kincaid agreed, but she also knew they needed more than suspicion and instinct to move forward. They needed evidence, and preferably, they needed to find the missing campers before this situation became a recovery operation instead of a rescue. She decided to request surveillance on Halloran's property, while continuing the search for the 4 missing students. If Halloran was involved in the disappearances, eventually she would make a mistake, or lead them to evidence that would allow Kincaid to obtain search warrants for the property. What Kincaid didn't know as they drove back toward the main highway was that Maeve Halloran was already making preparations for the eventuality that law enforcement would return with more authority and fewer restrictions. And the secret that Halloran had been protecting for 3 decades in the isolation of Oregon's coastal forests was far darker and more disturbing than Kincaid could yet imagine. Sheriff Arden Kincaid spent the next 48 hours coordinating a surveillance operation on Maeve Halloran's remote property while simultaneously managing the expanded search for the 4 missing campers. The surveillance was delicate work, requiring deputies to position themselves far enough away that Halloran wouldn't detect their presence, but close enough to observe any significant activity on the property. The isolation that made Halloran's cabin an ideal location for hiding secrets also made it nearly impossible to watch without being noticed. But Kincaid had worked these coastal forests long enough to know the back roads and hidden vantage points that might provide useful observation positions. Deputy Torrance took the first surveillance shift, positioning himself on a ridge approximately half a mile from Halloran's property with a clear view of the main cabin and outbuildings through binoculars. What he observed over the course of 8 hours was mundane but revealing. Halloran emerged from the cabin several times to tend to various outdoor tasks, chopping wood, checking solar panels, and carrying supplies between the cabin and the larger workshop structure. She moved with the efficiency of someone who had performed these routines thousands of times, never wasting motion, and always appearing alert to her surroundings. At one point, she seemed to pause and stare directly toward the ridge where Torrance was concealed, causing him to freeze and wonder if she had somehow detected his presence despite his careful positioning. But after a long moment, she simply returned to her tasks. The most interesting observation came in the late afternoon, when Halloran loaded a large backpack into an old pickup truck and drove away from the property, heading deeper into the forest on a rough track that Torrance hadn't even noticed during their initial visit. He immediately radioed Kincaid with this information, and together they made the decision to follow Halloran at a distance to see where she was going. Torrance waited until Halloran's vehicle was out of sight, then carefully made his way down from his observation position to his own patrol vehicle, which he had hidden nearly a mile away on an abandoned logging road. Tracking someone through the maze of forest roads in this area required local knowledge and careful judgment about when to maintain visual contact and when to hang back far enough to avoid detection. Torrance had grown up hunting in these woods, and he used that experience to follow the faint dust trails and subtle disturbances that indicated recent vehicle passage. After nearly 40 minutes of slow, careful pursuit, he found himself approaching an area he recognized, a section of old-growth forest near the boundary of the Cape Perpetua scenic area, not far from where the 4 campers had disappeared. Torrance stopped his vehicle and proceeded on foot, moving as quietly as possible through the dense undergrowth. The fog that perpetually haunted this coastline had thickened as evening approached, creating visibility conditions that were both advantageous and dangerous. He was less likely to be spotted, but also less able to see where he was going or what might be waiting ahead. After 10 minutes of careful movement, he heard sounds that made him pause and take cover behind a massive fallen log covered with moss and small ferns. Someone was digging, the distinctive sound of a shovel biting into earth carrying clearly through the damp air. From his concealed position, Torrance could see Halloran approximately 50 yards ahead, working methodically with a short-handled spade in a small clearing surrounded by ancient trees. She had dug what appeared to be a shallow hole, perhaps 2 feet deep and 3 feet across, and was now carefully placing something wrapped in dark plastic into the depression. Even at this distance and in the poor light, Torrance could see that she was handling whatever she was burying with great care, positioning it precisely before beginning to shovel the displaced earth back into the hole. Torrance's training told him he was potentially witnessing evidence disposal related to the missing campers, but he also knew that approaching Halloran now, alone and in an isolated location, would be both dangerous and potentially compromising to the investigation. He needed to document what he was seeing and maintain surveillance until he could bring backup and the proper resources to excavate whatever Halloran was burying. He carefully retrieved his camera and began taking photographs, using the maximum zoom to capture images of Halloran, the location, and the burial activity. For the next 20 minutes, Torrance watched as Halloran finished filling the hole, then spent considerable time camouflaging the disturbed earth with forest debris, fallen branches, moss, and loose vegetation arranged so carefully that within minutes the location looked completely natural, indistinguishable from the surrounding forest floor. She then spent several more minutes walking around the area, apparently checking her work from different angles and making small adjustments to ensure the site was completely hidden. Finally, she collected her tools and walked back toward where she had parked her vehicle, passing within 30 feet of where Torrance was concealed. As Halloran walked past, Torrance got his clearest look yet at the woman who had become the focus of his investigation. Her face showed no emotion, just the neutral concentration of someone completing a familiar task. She wasn't nervous or hurried. She was simply efficient, like someone who had done this exact thing many times before, and knew exactly how to do it without making mistakes. That chilling competence made Torrance's skin crawl with the realization that they might be dealing with something far worse than a single incident of missing campers. Once Holleran's vehicle had departed and enough time had passed to ensure she wasn't returning, Torrance carefully approached the location where she had been digging. Even knowing exactly where to look, he had difficulty identifying the precise spot where the burial had occurred. Holleran's camouflage work was extraordinarily effective. He marked the location using GPS coordinates and took extensive photographs from multiple angles, documenting the surrounding trees and landmarks that would allow them to return to this exact spot with excavation equipment. He reported his observations to Sheriff Kincaid, who immediately began the process of obtaining a search warrant for both the burial site and Holleran's property. The photographs and Torrance's testimony about watching Holleran bury something in the forest provided probable cause, but Kincaid knew that the warrant process would take time, potentially several hours, even with a judge who understood the urgency. In the meantime, she assigned additional deputies to maintain surveillance on both the burial site and Holleran's cabin, ensuring that no one disturbed either location before they could be properly searched. While waiting for the warrant to be approved, Kincaid made a decision that would prove crucial to understanding the full scope of what had been happening in the coastal forests of Coos County. She returned to the department archives and pulled every unsolved missing persons case from the past 30 years, the entire period during which Maeve Holleran had lived in the area. What she found was both shocking and horrifying in its implications. In addition to the 11 cases she had already identified from the past 15 years, there were another 17 missing persons cases from the 15 years before that, a total of 28 people who had disappeared from the coastal forests of Coos County since 1989, when Holleran had first purchased her isolated property. Not all of these cases fit the pattern of campers vanishing from undisturbed campsites. Some were hikers who had simply failed to return from day trips. Others were individuals who had gone into the forest alone and never been seen again. But the sheer number of disappearances was staggering when viewed as a whole, and the geographic concentration within that 20-mile stretch of coastline became impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Kincaid created a detailed map plotting the location of every disappearance, using different colored pins to indicate the year each person had vanished. The resulting visualization was chilling. A dense cluster of pins concentrated in the forests between Cape Arago and Cape Perpetua, with Maeve Holleran's property sitting almost exactly in the center of the cluster. The pattern suggested not just a single predator operating in a defined territory, but a predator who had been operating successfully for 3 decades, taking victims with such skill that each disappearance had been investigated and closed as an individual tragedy, rather than recognized as part of a larger criminal pattern. The search warrant was approved at 11:47 p.m., authorizing law enforcement to excavate the burial site and search Holleran's property for evidence related to the missing campers. Kincaid assembled a team that included Deputy Torrance, 4 additional deputies, 2 forensic investigators from the Oregon State Police Crime Lab, and a cadaver dog unit. They would execute the search at dawn, beginning with the burial site to preserve evidence before Holleran could potentially become aware of their activities and attempt to interfere. The team gathered in the darkness at a staging area several miles from the burial site, reviewing the operation plan and ensuring everyone understood their roles. The fog was particularly thick that night, reducing visibility to less than 20 feet and creating an oppressive atmosphere that seemed to amplify every sound. Kincaid briefed the team on the situation, emphasizing that they were potentially dealing with a suspect who had extensive knowledge of the terrain and who might be dangerous if confronted. She also reminded them that 4 people were still missing and might be alive somewhere, making speed essential but also requiring careful attention to any evidence that might lead to their location. As dawn broke with its usual reluctance in the coastal fog, the team moved into position around the burial site. The forensic investigators began their work, while deputies established a perimeter to ensure privacy and security. The cadaver dogs, German shepherds trained to detect human remains, were brought to the immediate area and immediately began showing interest in the location Torrance had marked, confirming that something significant was buried there. The excavation proceeded with painstaking care, the forensic team removing earth one careful layer at a time and screening every shovelful for potential evidence. Within 30 minutes, they uncovered the dark plastic bundle that Torrance had seen Halloran bury. The package was carefully removed and photographed in place before being opened under the supervision of Dr. Patricia Oakes, the lead forensic investigator. What they found inside was not what anyone had expected. The plastic wrapping contained not human remains but a collection of personal items: wallets, driver's licenses, cell phones, jewelry, watches, and other belongings that clearly had been taken from multiple different people over an extended period of time. Dr. Oakes spread the items out on a tarp and began documenting each one, while Kincaid and Torrance examined the identification cards and began to realize the horrifying significance of what they had discovered. The items belonged to at least 12 different individuals, and a quick check against missing persons files confirmed that these were belongings from people who had disappeared from the coastal forests over the past 2 decades. "She's been collecting trophies," Dr. Oakes said quietly, her professional composure not quite concealing her disturbed reaction to the discovery. "These items are from victims, and she buried them here recently, probably after she realized we were investigating the new disappearances and might eventually connect them to her." She held up a driver's license with a photograph of a young man smiling at the camera, unaware of the fate that awaited him. "This is evidence of serial murder, Sheriff. We're looking at one of the most prolific killers in Oregon history." Kincaid felt a cold rage building in her chest as she looked at the collection of items representing lives that had been taken, families that had been devastated, and decades of crimes that had gone undetected. But she also felt the urgent pressure of knowing that 4 people might still be alive, held captive somewhere by a woman who had proven herself capable of killing with impunity for 30 years. Finding those 4 campers before Halloran could harm them became the absolute priority. "We move on her property now," Kincaid ordered, making the tactical decision to abandon the careful approach in favor of immediate action. "She knows we're closing in, that's why she was disposing of evidence. If those campers are still alive, they're running out of time." She radioed for additional backup and requested that a tactical team be mobilized to assist with what was now clearly going to be a high-risk operation. The convoy of law enforcement vehicles descended on Maeve Halloran's isolated property less than an hour later, approaching from multiple directions to prevent any possibility of escape. Kincaid had obtained a warrant to search the property based on the evidence found at the burial site, and she had every intention of using whatever force was necessary to locate the missing campers and take Halloran into custody. As the vehicles converged on the cabin, deputies spread out to cover all possible exit routes, while Kincaid approached the front door with Torrance and 2 other deputies, their weapons drawn and ready for confrontation. The cabin appeared quiet, smoke still rising from the chimney as it had during their previous visit. Kincaid announced their presence loudly, identifying herself and demanding that Halloran come out with her hands visible. There was no response, and after waiting the appropriate time for compliance, Kincaid gave the order to breach the door. Deputies used a battering ram to force entry, and the team swept through the small cabin quickly and efficiently, clearing each room and searching for both Halloran and any sign of the missing campers. The cabin was empty, though clearly someone had been there recently. A half-finished cup of coffee sat on the kitchen table, still slightly warm to the touch. The interior was spartanly furnished but meticulously organized, with shelves of books about forest ecology, wildlife biology, and wilderness survival. A desk in one corner held a computer and several notebooks filled with handwritten observations about the coastal forest ecosystem. Everything appeared to be the normal possessions of someone who lived alone and pursued naturalist studies, with nothing immediately visible that suggested criminal activity. But Deputy Torrance, searching a closet in the bedroom, made a discovery that changed everything. Behind a false panel in the back of the closet, he found a narrow doorway leading to a hidden room that had been constructed within the cabin's walls. The secret room was small, perhaps 8 feet by 10 feet, but it was filled with items that left no doubt about Maeve Holloran's activities over the past 3 decades. The walls were covered with photographs. Dozens of photographs showing people hiking, camping, and moving through the coastal forests, clearly taken without the subject's knowledge or consent. Many of the faces in the photographs matched missing persons files that Kincaid had been reviewing. More disturbing were the notebooks stacked on a small desk in the hidden room, detailed journals documenting what Holloran called her reclamation project. As Kincaid began reading the entries, the full scope of Holloran's ideology and criminal activities became horrifyingly clear. Holloran believed that humans were a destructive presence in the natural world, and she had taken it upon herself to reclaim what she viewed as pristine wilderness areas by removing people she deemed unworthy of accessing these spaces. The journals described her selection process. She targeted individuals or groups who she believed showed disrespect for the forest, whether through littering, loud behavior, or simply what she perceived as a casual attitude toward the wilderness. The journals also described in clinical detail how Holloran had killed her victims over the years. She used her extensive knowledge of the coastal forests to ambush people in isolated locations, often approaching them under the pretense of offering helpful information or warning them about dangerous conditions. She would guide them deeper into the forest to locations she had prepared in advance, where she could control the situation completely. The methods varied, but they all exploited the dangerous terrain and isolation of the coastal wilderness, leading people to cliff edges in the fog, guiding them into areas where they would become hopelessly lost, or, in some cases, simply using physical force when she had lured them far enough from any possible help. What made the journals particularly chilling was Holloran's lack of remorse or recognition that her actions were criminal. She wrote about her victims with the detached tone of a scientist describing research subjects, noting how each reclamation had made the forest safer for wildlife and more pristine for those she deemed worthy of experiencing it. She kept detailed records of where she had disposed of bodies, describing remote caves, deep ravines, and offshore locations where remains would never be recovered. The casual nature of her documentation suggested someone who genuinely believed she was performing a service rather than committing murder. But the most urgent information in the journals related to her most recent victims, the 4 campers from Cape Perpetua. Holloran had observed them on their first day at the campsite and had determined they were disrespectful tourists who needed to be removed. She had approached their campsite after dark, using a tactic she had employed successfully many times before, creating sounds in the forest that mimicked a person in distress, calling for help. When the campers had emerged from their tents to investigate, she had used a flashlight to lead them away from the campsite, deeper into the forest, under the pretense of guiding them to someone who needed assistance. According to the journal entries, Holloran had led the 4 campers nearly 2 miles from their campsite to a location she referred to as the Teaching Cave, one of several places she used for what she described as helping people understand their impact on the wilderness. The journal didn't explicitly describe what happened in these locations, but the implication was clear and horrifying. Most significantly, the journal entry was dated 2 days earlier, and there was no indication that Holloran had yet completed what she called the reclamation process for these particular victims. This suggested the possibility that the 4 campers might still be alive, held somewhere in this teaching cave, while Holloran decided their ultimate fate. "We need to find this cave immediately," Kincaid said urgently, studying the journal entries for any indication of its location. Halloran had been careful not to include specific coordinates or directions in her writings, referring to the various locations she used only by names that meant something to her, but would be meaningless to anyone else. The teaching cave could be anywhere in the thousands of acres of coastal forest and cliff formations that characterize this area. The search of the property continued with increased urgency. Teams of deputies and forensic investigators combing through every outbuilding and searching for any maps, GPS devices, or other materials that might indicate the locations Halloran had used for her crimes. In the workshop building behind the cabin, they found a large table covered with topographic maps of the coastal region, many of them annotated with symbols and notes in Halloran's handwriting. Dr. Oakes photographed all of the maps in place before the team began analyzing them for clues about the locations of interest. One map in particular drew Kincaid's attention, a detailed topographic chart of the coastal cliffs and sea caves in the area directly north of Halloran's property. Several locations were marked with symbols that appeared to indicate caves or cavities in the cliff faces, and one of these marks had a notation beside it that read, "Primary teaching location, optimal isolation." The location was approximately 3 miles from Halloran's cabin, in an area of extremely rugged coastal terrain where cliffs dropped 200 feet to the ocean below, and the forest grew thick and dark even during daytime. Kincaid organized an immediate response, assembling a team that included deputies experienced in technical rescue operations, and requesting assistance from the Coast Guard for water-based access to the coastal caves. The terrain was too dangerous to approach in the fog and fading light, so powerful portable lighting was brought in to illuminate the operation. As the team prepared to move out, one of the deputies searching the property made another crucial discovery: fresh tire tracks leading away from the cabin on a little-used forest road that headed north, directly toward the area where the annotated map suggested the teaching cave was located. "She knew we were coming, and she's gone to them," Torrance said grimly, studying the tire tracks. "Sheriff, if she thinks we're about to discover her victims, she might kill them to eliminate evidence. We need to move fast." Kincaid agreed, and the operation shifted from a careful search to an emergency rescue, with speed becoming as important as caution. The 3-mile journey to the coastal cliff area took nearly an hour, even with GPS guidance and multiple vehicles, due to the extremely rough terrain and the need to approach quietly in case Halloran was present at the location. The team proceeded on foot for the final half-mile, moving through dense forest in near-complete darkness despite their flashlights, the sound of waves crashing against cliffs somewhere ahead, providing an ominous soundtrack to their advance. The fog was so thick that the powerful lights created only small bubbles of visibility, and the team members had to stay close together to avoid becoming separated. As they neared the coordinates indicated on Halloran's map, Deputy Torrance, who was leading the advance team, raised his hand to signal a halt. Ahead, barely visible through the fog and darkness, a faint light source was glowing. As the team moved closer with extreme caution, they could see that the light was coming from inside a cavity in the cliff face. A cave entrance partially concealed by vegetation but now illuminated from within by what appeared to be battery-powered lanterns. Kincaid made the tactical decision to announce their presence rather than attempt a stealthy approach through the dangerous terrain in the darkness. She used her radio to broadcast a message that would be picked up by any law enforcement radio equipment in the area, identifying herself and demanding that Maeve Halloran exit the cave with her hands visible. There was no response, but the light inside the cave shifted, suggesting movement. The team advanced to the cave entrance, weapons ready and moving with the careful coordination of officers who had trained for high-risk operations. The cave opening was approximately 6 feet wide and 8 feet tall, leading into darkness beyond the range of the lights they had set up. Kincaid positioned deputies at the entrance while she and Torrance, along with 2 tactical team members, prepared to enter the cave and conduct a rescue of any victims who might be inside. What they found inside that coastal cave would become the most horrifying crime scene that Coos County had ever documented, and would reveal that Maeve Holleran's teaching methods were even more disturbing than her journals had suggested. The cave extended back into the cliff face for approximately 40 feet before opening into a larger chamber that had clearly been modified and prepared for holding prisoners. The walls showed signs of tool marks where Holleran had enlarged certain areas and created recesses for storage. Heavy metal rings had been bolted into the rock at various points, with chains attached that were long enough to allow limited movement, but not enough to reach the cave entrance. And, in the dim light of the battery-powered lanterns, they found 3 of the 4 missing campers, alive, but in conditions that would haunt Kincaid for the rest of her career. The 3 victims were chained to the wall rings, showing signs of exposure, dehydration, and psychological trauma that came from days of captivity in complete darkness, except when Holleran visited them. They were conscious, but appeared barely able to process what was happening as the rescue team approached, their eyes showing the vacant expression of people who had been pushed beyond normal human endurance. But even as deputies began the process of freeing the victims and providing emergency medical care, Kincaid realized with growing dread that only 3 people were present in the cave. According to the initial reports, 4 campers had disappeared from Cape Perpetua. 1 was still missing, and there was no sign of that person anywhere in the cave system. As she helped wrap one of the rescued victims in thermal blankets and began asking gentle questions about what had happened to them, she received the answer she had been dreading. "She took him away," the victim whispered, her voice raw from screaming for help that never came. "The first night, she took him away and he never came back. She said he failed the teaching, and she showed us what would happen if we failed too." The young woman began crying, unable or unwilling to describe what Holleran had shown them as motivation to comply with whatever her twisted version of teaching had involved. Kincaid felt rage and sorrow mixing in her chest as she realized that they had arrived too late to save all 4 victims, that Holleran had already killed one of them during the 3 days they had been held in this nightmare location. But she also felt a grim determination to find Holleran before she could escape the area and potentially establish herself in a new territory where she could continue her reclamation project with more victims. She ordered a full search of the cave system and the surrounding area while emergency medical personnel transported the 3 rescued victims to the nearest hospital. The search of the cave revealed more horrors: a storage area where Holleran had kept supplies for her captives, minimal food and water that she apparently doled out as rewards or punishments depending on how the victims responded to her teaching. There were also journals and notebooks describing the psychological techniques she used to break down her victims' resistance and force them to acknowledge their supposed crimes against the wilderness. The level of planning and preparation evident in the cave setup suggested that Holleran had been using this location for years, refining her methods with each group of victims she brought here. But Maeve Holleran herself was nowhere to be found. Despite an intensive search of the area that continued through the night and into the next day, she had vanished into the coastal forests as completely as her victims once had. The old pickup truck the deputies had tracked to the area was found abandoned a mile from the cave, and tracking dogs were unable to follow her scent trail beyond a small creek that might have allowed her to move through the water without leaving traces. As dawn broke on what had been one of the longest nights of Kincaid's career, she stood at the entrance to the cave and looked out over the fog-shrouded forest, knowing that somewhere in that vast wilderness, a predator who had killed more than 24 people over 3 decades was still at large, still free to continue her twisted mission of protecting the forests from those she deemed unworthy. The rescue of 3 victims and the discovery of Holleran's crimes was a success by any measure. But it was incomplete success, haunted by the knowledge that justice had not yet been fully served. The 3 rescued campers were hospitalized and would require extensive physical and psychological treatment to recover from their ordeal. Interviews with them would eventually provide detailed information about Halloran's methods and ideology, helping authorities understand the mind of someone who could justify serial murder as environmental protection. But those interviews would also reveal that Halloran had spoken often about her future plans, about other areas of wilderness that needed her protection, suggesting that her disappearance was not an ending, but a relocation to continue her work somewhere beyond the reach of Coos County law enforcement. For Sheriff Arden Kincaid, the case would remain open indefinitely, a constant reminder that even in the small, close-knit communities of rural Oregon, evil could flourish in isolation for decades before being discovered. And in the fog-drenched coastal forests where she had spent her entire career, there would always be the unsettling knowledge that Maeve Halloran might be watching from the shadows, waiting for the attention to fade so she could return to the wilderness she believed she was protecting through murder. 3 weeks after the rescue of the survivors from Maeve Halloran's coastal cave, Sheriff Arden Kincaid found herself standing in the morgue of Bay Area Hospital in Coos Bay, staring down at remains that had been recovered from one of the locations marked in Halloran's journals. The body had been found in a deep ravine 15 miles south of Cape Perpetua, exactly where Halloran's meticulous notes had indicated she had disposed of a victim she identified only as the Loud One from summer 2 seasons past. The forensic anthropologist working on the case had determined that the remains belonged to a male in his mid-20s, and dental records had confirmed what Kincaid had already suspected from the description. This was one of the 4 campers who had disappeared from Cape Perpetua, the one who hadn't survived Halloran's twisted teaching process. Dr. Raymond Cutler, the forensic pathologist who had been brought in from Portland to assist with the expanding investigation, pointed to several marks on the bones that told the story of the victim's final hours. Cause of death was blunt force trauma to the skull, he explained, in the clinical tone that medical professionals use to maintain emotional distance from their work. But before that, he suffered multiple injuries consistent with being forced to navigate extremely rough terrain while restrained. Fractures to both ankles, deep lacerations on the hands and feet, evidence of prolonged exposure to cold and wet conditions. He paused, his professional demeanor cracking slightly. Sheriff, this young man was tortured before he was killed. Halloran's teaching was systematic abuse designed to break him down psychologically and physically. Kincaid felt the familiar rage building in her chest, the same anger that had been her constant companion since discovering the full scope of Halloran's crimes. 28 victims over 30 years, each one subjected to Halloran's deranged ideology, before being murdered and hidden in the vast wilderness of the Oregon coast. The 3 survivors from the cave had provided detailed statements describing Halloran's methods, how she would lecture them for hours about their supposed crimes against nature, how she would deprive them of food and water, until they agreed to confess their unworthiness to visit the forests, how she would threaten them with the same fate that had befallen their friend if they didn't properly understand her lessons. But understanding Halloran's methods and ideology didn't bring Kincaid any closer to finding the woman herself. Despite an intensive manhunt that had involved multiple agencies and extended across 3 states, Maeve Halloran had vanished as completely as if she had never existed. The FBI had taken over coordination of the search, declaring Halloran one of their most wanted fugitives and distributing her photograph and description to law enforcement agencies nationwide. But the woman who had spent 30 years living in complete isolation knew how to survive in wilderness areas that would kill most people within days, and she had decades of experience avoiding detection when she didn't want to be found. Kincaid had spent every available hour following leads, reviewing evidence, and coordinating with other agencies to track down any trace of Halloran. She had interviewed the 3 survivors multiple times, hoping that some detail from their ordeal might provide a clue about where Halloran would go or what she might do next. She had analyzed every notation in Halloran's journals, every mark on her maps, every photograph in her hidden room, looking for patterns that might predict the woman's movements or reveal other locations she might use as hiding places. The investigation had expanded beyond just finding Halloran to include the massive task of recovering and identifying all of her victims from the past 3 decades. Deputy Torrance was leading teams to the locations marked in Halloran's journals, using ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and expert search teams to locate remains that had been hidden for years or even decades. Each recovery was a grim reminder of how long Halloran had operated with impunity, and each identification brought closure to families who had spent years wondering what had happened to their loved ones. But for Kincaid, the most frustrating aspect of the investigation was the growing realization that Halloran had been planning her eventual escape for years, possibly decades. The hidden room in her cabin had contained not just evidence of past crimes but also preparations for future ones, multiple sets of identification documents with different names, detailed maps of wilderness areas throughout the Pacific Northwest and Northern California, and journals describing other locations she had scouted as potential territories for her reclamation project. The woman had clearly anticipated that she might someday need to relocate her operations, and she had prepared accordingly. On a gray morning, 4 weeks after the cave rescue, Kincaid received a call that would reignite the investigation and provide the first real lead on Halloran's whereabouts since her disappearance. A sheriff's deputy in Josephine County, Oregon, nearly 200 miles south of Coos County, had responded to a report of a suspicious person camping illegally on private land near the town of Cave Junction. When the deputy attempted to make contact with the camper, the individual had fled into the forest, leaving behind camping equipment and supplies. Among the abandoned items was a notebook containing writings that bore striking similarities to Halloran's journals. The same obsessive documentation of forest ecology, the same rhetoric about humans as destructive forces, the same careful observations of other campers and hikers in the area. Kincaid was in her vehicle within minutes of receiving the call, making the 4-hour drive to Josephine County with Deputy Torrance and assembling a response team as she traveled. The Josephine County Sheriff's Department had secured the abandoned campsite and was conducting a search of the surrounding area, but the forest terrain in this region was even more rugged and remote than the coastal forests of Coos County, offering countless hiding places for someone with Halloran's survival skills. When Kincaid arrived at the scene, she met with Josephine County Sheriff Dale Pritchard, a weathered veteran of rural law enforcement who had worked the southern Oregon wilderness for more than 20 years. Pritchard led her to the abandoned campsite, a carefully concealed location beneath a rock overhang that would have been invisible to anyone not specifically searching for it. The setup was minimal but efficient: a small tent, sleeping bag, cooking equipment, and several days' worth of food supplies. But it was the notebook that captured Kincaid's attention. A spiral-bound journal filled with handwriting she recognized immediately as Maeve Halloran's distinctive script. "She's been here for at least a week, maybe longer," Pritchard explained, as Kincaid carefully examined the notebook without touching it, preserving it as evidence. "My deputy said she looked like she was in her 50s or 60s. Gray hair, matched the description from your bolo. She was watching a group of hikers on the Illinois River Trail when he approached, and she ran the moment she saw his uniform." He gestured toward the dense forest that surrounded the campsite. "This country is some of the most remote in Oregon. Thousands of acres of wilderness, cave systems, old mining claims. She could hide out here indefinitely if she knows what she's doing." Kincaid read through the notebook entries, each one confirming what she had feared. Halloran hadn't fled to escape justice or hide from pursuit. She had relocated to continue her mission in a new territory, and she was already identifying potential victims among the hikers and campers who visited this area. The entries described several individuals in disturbing detail, noting their behavior, their apparent attitudes toward the wilderness, and their suitability for what Halloran continued to call reclamation and teaching. One entry was particularly chilling. The lesson from the coastal territory was that patience is essential. The new sanctuary requires careful preparation before teaching can resume. But the forests here are pure, and the candidates are plentiful. "She's planning to start again," Kincaid said, looking up from the notebook to meet Pritchard's eyes. "This isn't someone on the run trying to avoid capture. This is someone who sees herself as continuing important work that was temporarily interrupted. We need to find her before she takes anyone else." The two sheriffs began coordinating an expanded search operation, bringing in resources from multiple agencies including the FBI, Oregon State Police, and specialized tracking units with experience in wilderness manhunts. Over the next 72 hours, the search for Maeve Halloran intensified into one of the largest law enforcement operations Southern Oregon had seen in years. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging flew grid patterns over the vast forested areas surrounding Cave Junction. Ground teams with tracking dogs worked through dense undergrowth and rugged canyons. Local law enforcement officers interviewed everyone who had been camping or hiking in the area, warning them about the danger and asking if they had seen anyone matching Halloran's description. The search was complicated by the terrain itself. The Illinois River watershed contained some of the most rugged and inaccessible wilderness in the Pacific Northwest, with deep canyons, extensive cave systems, and old-growth forests so dense that visibility was measured in feet rather than yards. The area had been used by miners in the 19th century, and abandoned claims dotted the landscape, many of them containing structures or excavations that could provide shelter for someone trying to avoid detection. Halloran could potentially survive for months in this environment, living off the land and moving constantly to stay ahead of search teams. But Kincaid had learned from studying Halloran's patterns in Coos County that the woman was compulsive about maintaining her routines and documenting her activities. She couldn't simply hide. She needed to observe, to study, to prepare for the next phase of her mission. That compulsion would eventually create opportunities for law enforcement to locate her, if they could position themselves correctly and wait patiently for her to reveal her presence. Deputy Torrance, who had become deeply invested in the case after witnessing Halloran's burial of evidence and participating in the cave rescue, developed a theory about where Halloran might establish herself in this new territory. "She needs isolation, but also access to areas where people camp and hike," he explained to Kincaid as they studied topographic maps of the region. In Coos County, she positioned herself right in the middle of the area with the highest density of campgrounds and trails. She'll do the same thing here. He traced his finger along the map, indicating a section of wilderness between two popular hiking areas. This area right here, it's got water sources, natural shelter, and it's positioned perfectly to observe the Illinois River Trail and the Kalmiopsis Rim Trail. If I were her, this is where I'd set up. Kincaid studied the map carefully, recognizing the logic in Torrance's analysis. The area he had identified was approximately 8 miles from the abandoned campsite, remote enough to provide security, but positioned to allow observation of the two most popular hiking routes in the region. She made the decision to focus resources on that area, positioning surveillance teams at strategic points and establishing a command post that would allow them to coordinate a rapid response if Halloran was spotted. The breakthrough came on the 5th day of the search, when a Forest Service ranger conducting a routine patrol in the area Torrance had identified noticed something unusual: fresh boot prints on a little-used trail that led deeper into the wilderness. The prints were recent, probably made within the past 24 hours, and they showed a distinctive wear pattern that matched boots recovered from Halloran's cabin in Coos County. The ranger immediately reported the finding, and Kincaid mobilized tracking teams to follow the trail while maintaining enough distance to avoid alerting Halloran to their presence. The tracks led through increasingly difficult terrain, following game trails and creek beds in a way that suggested intimate knowledge of the area and a deliberate attempt to confuse pursuers. Whoever had made these tracks knew they might be followed, and was taking precautions to make tracking difficult. But Halloran's compulsive nature worked against her. The tracks eventually led to another carefully concealed campsite. This one positioned beneath a rock ledge with a clear view of both the Illinois River Trail below and the surrounding forest. The campsite was occupied when the tracking team located it, and through careful observation from a concealed position nearly 200 yards away, they confirmed that the person at the site matched Maeve Halloran's description. She appeared to be engaged in her familiar routine of documenting observations in a notebook, occasionally using binoculars to watch the distant trail where hikers passed, unaware of the predator observing them from the forest. Kincaid received the report with a mixture of relief and grim determination. After more than a month of searching, they had finally located Halloran, and now came the most dangerous part of the operation, taking her into custody without anyone getting hurt and without giving her another opportunity to escape into the wilderness. She assembled a tactical team that included deputies from both Coos and Josephine counties, Oregon State Police tactical officers, and FBI agents with experience in high-risk apprehensions. The team would approach from multiple directions simultaneously, using the terrain to maintain concealment until they were close enough to prevent escape. The operation was planned for dawn the following day, timed to catch Halloran when she would be least alert and when the morning light would give law enforcement teams better visibility while still providing some cover. Kincaid spent the night reviewing every detail of the plan, knowing that Halloran had proven herself capable of extraordinary awareness and quick thinking in dangerous situations. This would be their only opportunity. If Halloran escaped again, she might disappear so completely that they would never find her. As the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the forest canopy, tactical teams moved into position around Halloran's campsite, approaching with painstaking stealth through terrain that seemed designed to betray any movement with sound or disturbed vegetation. Each team member understood the stakes. They were hunting someone who had killed nearly 30 people over 3 decades, someone who knew these forests intimately and who would not surrender easily if she realized she was cornered. Kincaid positioned herself with the team approaching from the south, the direction that would allow them to cut off escape routes toward deeper wilderness. Through the undergrowth, she could see the rock ledge where Halloran had established her camp, and she could make out the shape of someone moving near the small tent that had been erected in the sheltered space. The teams moved closer, maintaining communications through silent hand signals and staying low to avoid being silhouetted against the gradually brightening sky. When the teams were in position, approximately 50 yards from the campsite, and arranged to cover all possible escape routes, Kincaid gave the signal to move in. Tactical officers rose from concealment and advanced rapidly toward the camp, weapons raised and voices announcing law enforcement presence. For a moment, Halloran seemed frozen by surprise, standing near her tent with a notebook in her hands and an expression of shock on her face. Then, with the speed of someone much younger than her apparent age, she dropped the notebook and bolted toward the one gap in the perimeter that appeared to offer escape, a narrow path between 2 large boulders that led down a steep slope toward the river canyon below. Deputy Torrance, positioned exactly where Kincaid had placed him based on her prediction of Halloran's most likely escape route, stepped into the gap with his weapon drawn. "Stop right there, Halloran," he commanded. "There's nowhere to go. You're surrounded." For a moment, Halloran hesitated. Her body coiled as if preparing to fight or try to push past Torrance despite the obvious futility. Kincaid saw the calculation in the woman's eyes, the rapid assessment of options and consequences that came from decades of surviving in hostile environments. "It's over, Maeve," Kincaid said firmly, moving closer with her own weapon trained on Halloran. We found your journals. We found your victims. We know everything you've done for the past 30 years. You can either come with us peacefully, or we can do this the hard way. But either way, you're not going free." The words hung in the morning air, and for several long seconds the outcome remained uncertain. Halloran stood poised between fight and flight, her weathered face showing no emotion, but her body language radiating tension and barely controlled violence. Then, slowly, Halloran raised her hands in surrender, though the expression on her face was not one of defeat, but rather of contemptuous defiance. "You think this is over?" she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the silence of the forest. "You think arresting me solves anything? The forests are still being destroyed by people who don't understand or respect them. My work will continue whether I'm here to do it or not." The statement sent a chill through Kincaid, not just because of the implicit threat, but because of the absolute conviction with which Halloran spoke, as if her ideology was so obviously correct that any reasonable person would understand and agree with it. Halloran was taken into custody without further resistance, handcuffed and searched for weapons before being escorted back through the forest to waiting vehicles. The search of her new campsite revealed another collection of journals and notebooks, more detailed observations of potential victims, and most disturbingly, a partially completed map showing locations in Northern California and Southern Washington, where Halloran had apparently been planning to expand her reclamation project if her Oregon sanctuaries became compromised. The evidence confirmed what Kincaid had suspected. Halloran hadn't been hiding or fleeing. She had been preparing to scale up her operations and establish multiple territories where she could continue killing indefinitely. The drive back to Coos County took most of the day, with Halloran secured in a transport vehicle and surrounded by law enforcement officers who took no chances with the woman who had evaded capture for so long. Kincaid rode in a separate vehicle, feeling the exhaustion of the past month settling into her bones now that the immediate crisis was over. But alongside the exhaustion was a deep sense of satisfaction. They had caught Halloran, prevented her from establishing new killing grounds, and brought some measure of justice to the families of her victims. Halloran was processed into the Coos County Jail and charged with multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and other crimes related to her 3 decades of predation in the coastal forests. Her arraignment drew national media attention, with journalists from across the country descending on the small coastal county to cover the case of what some were calling the Wilderness Killer. The 3 survivors from Cape Perpetua gave victim impact statements describing their ordeal in Halloran's cave, and families of other victims traveled from multiple states to attend the proceedings and finally learn what had happened to their loved ones. But for Kincaid, the most revealing moment came during her only direct interview with Halloran after the arrest. The interview took place in a secure room at the county jail, with Halloran seated across a metal table from Kincaid and displaying the same cold composure she had shown throughout the process. When Kincaid asked her directly why she had killed so many people over such a long period of time, Halloran's answer was delivered without hesitation or apparent remorse. "Because they didn't belong in those forests," Halloran said simply. "They treated the wilderness as their personal playground, with no understanding of the damage they were causing or the privilege they were abusing. Someone had to protect these places from the people who would destroy them through ignorance and carelessness." She paused, and something that might have been satisfaction flickered across her face. "I gave each of them a chance to understand, to learn why their presence was harmful. Most of them failed that test. The forests are better off without them." The absolute conviction in Halloran's voice, the complete absence of any recognition that her actions were criminal or immoral, provided a chilling insight into the psychology of someone who had constructed an entire ideology to justify serial murder. She genuinely believed she had been performing a necessary service, protecting wilderness areas from human contamination. The fact that this required killing dozens of people over 3 decades was, in her mind, simply the price that had to be paid for environmental preservation. Kincaid ended the interview shortly after that exchange, recognizing that there was no point in trying to make Halloran acknowledge the harm she had caused or feel remorse for her victims. The woman was not insane in any legal sense. She understood exactly what she had done and had planned each murder carefully, but she operated from a moral framework so divorced from normal human values that concepts like guilt or compassion simply didn't apply to her decision-making process. In the weeks that followed, as prosecutors built their case and forensic teams continued recovering remains from locations identified in Halloran's journals, Kincaid found herself reflecting on the nature of evil and how it could flourish in the empty spaces of rural America. Halloran hadn't been a monster in appearance or demeanor. She had been an educated, articulate person who could have contributed positively to environmental causes if her passion hadn't been twisted into something homicidal. But somewhere along the way, she had crossed a line that separated legitimate environmental concern from murderous extremism, and she had done it so gradually that she never recognized the transformation herself. The trial, when it eventually took place, was a formality rather than a genuine contest. The evidence against Halloran was overwhelming. Journals documenting her crimes, physical evidence linking her to multiple victims, testimony from survivors, and her own statements acknowledging her actions while insisting they were justified. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. The judge sentenced Halloran to multiple consecutive life terms without possibility of parole, effectively ensuring she would die in prison. But even as Halloran was led from the courtroom to begin serving her sentence, Kincaid couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't truly an ending. Halloran had spoken during sentencing, delivering a brief statement in which she expressed no remorse but instead predicted that others would eventually recognize the necessity of her work and continue it. "The wilderness will always need protection from those who would harm it," she had said calmly. "My methods may be condemned, but my purpose was righteous. Others will understand that, even if this court cannot." The statement haunted Kincaid in the weeks after the trial concluded, not because she believed Halloran would inspire copycat killers, but because it highlighted a disturbing truth about how isolated extremists could rationalize horrific actions as virtuous behavior. Halloran had spent 30 years killing people while genuinely believing she was making the world better, protecting something precious from destruction. That combination of conviction and delusion was perhaps more frightening than simple evil, because it suggested that anyone with strong enough beliefs and sufficient isolation could potentially travel down a similar path. As spring returned to the Oregon coast, and the forests once again filled with hikers and campers enjoying the spectacular beauty of the region, Sheriff Arden Kincaid continued her patrols of the coastal areas, now seeing them through the lens of what she had learned during the investigation. The same wilderness that offered peace and renewal to visitors had also provided perfect cover for decades of murder. The isolation that made these forests so appealing for those seeking escape from civilization had also allowed a killer to operate with impunity, taking victims who disappeared into the landscape as completely as if they had never existed. The case was closed, the killer imprisoned, and justice served in the eyes of the law. But for Kincaid, some questions remained unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. How many people had passed Halloran on the trails over the years, never knowing they were in the presence of a serial killer? How many potential victims had unknowingly avoided selection by behaving in ways that met Halloran's twisted criteria for respecting the wilderness? And most disturbingly, were there others like Halloran living in isolated areas throughout the country, developing their own ideological justifications for violence while law enforcement remained unaware of their existence? These questions had no satisfying answers, and Kincaid knew they would remain with her for the rest of her career. but she also knew that she had done everything possible to stop Halloran and prevent future victims from suffering the same fate as those who had died in the coastal forests. The wilderness remained beautiful and dangerous, appealing and deadly, exactly as it had always been. And somewhere in the maximum security prison where Maeve Halloran would spend the rest of her life, the woman who called herself a protector of forests sat in a concrete cell, still convinced that her murders had been necessary and justified, still believing that the wilderness was better off because of what she had done. 6 months after Maeve Halloran's conviction and sentencing, Sheriff Arden Kincaid stood at the edge of the Cape Perpetua overlook, watching fog roll in from the Pacific Ocean and swallow the coastline in its familiar gray embrace. The tourist season was in full swing, with families and hikers crowding the trails and campgrounds that stretched along this beautiful and deadly stretch of Oregon coast. To the visitors enjoying the spectacular scenery, the forests were places of recreation and natural beauty. But Kincaid could no longer look at these woods without seeing the hidden graves, the concealed observation points, and the carefully chosen ambush locations where Halloran had stalked her victims for 3 decades. The recovery of remains from locations identified in Halloran's journals had continued for months after the trial, with forensic teams methodically excavating sites throughout the coastal forests. They had recovered 23 bodies so far, each one representing a life taken and a family forever changed by Halloran's twisted ideology. The identifications had brought closure to some families who had spent years wondering about missing loved ones, but they had also opened old wounds and raised disturbing questions about how so many people could disappear from a relatively small geographic area without anyone recognizing the pattern. Deputy Torrance approached from the parking area, carrying 2 cups of coffee and looking as tired as Kincaid felt. The past months had been exhausting for the entire department, with the Halloran investigation consuming resources and personnel while regular law enforcement duties still needed to be maintained. Torrance handed Kincaid one of the cups and stood beside her, both of them looking out over the fog-shrouded forest in comfortable silence for a moment before he spoke. Forensics team found another site this morning, Torrance said quietly. About 8 miles south of here, exactly where Halloran's map indicated. They're still excavating, but it looks like at least 2 sets of remains, probably that couple from Washington who disappeared in 2011. He paused, taking a sip of his coffee. Sheriff, at what point do we stop finding bodies? Every time I think we've covered all of them. The journals lead us to another location. Kincaid understood his frustration and shared it. The enormity of Halloran's crimes continued to expand as each new recovery revealed the full scope of her predation. We keep looking until we've checked every location she documented, Kincaid replied firmly. These families deserve to know what happened to their loved ones, and those victims deserve to be properly buried instead of rotting in unmarked graves. We owe them that much, even if it takes years to complete. What troubled Kincaid more than the ongoing recovery operations was the question that had haunted her since Halloran's final statement in court. Were there others like her operating in isolated areas throughout the country? The FBI had taken that possibility seriously enough to launch a nationwide review of missing persons cases from remote wilderness areas, looking for patterns that might indicate other serial killers using Halloran's methods. The preliminary results had been disturbing. There were hundreds of unsolved disappearances from national forests, state parks, and other wilderness areas, many of them showing similarities to the cases in Coos County. Personal belongings left behind, no clear evidence of accidents or foul play, and victims who simply vanished into the landscape. The FBI had sent Special Agent Patricia Williams to Coos County to conduct follow-up interviews and gather information that might help identify other potential cases. Williams had spent 2 weeks reviewing the Halloran investigation files and interviewing Kincaid, Torrance, and the 3 survivors from the cave. She had also attempted to interview Halloran herself at the Oregon State Penitentiary, but the convicted killer had refused to speak with her, maintaining the silence she had adopted after her sentencing. Agent Williams had shared some of her findings with Kincaid before returning to FBI headquarters, and the information had been sobering. We're identifying at least 15 other cases nationwide that show remarkable similarities to Halloran's pattern, Williams had explained. Isolated killers who live in remote areas near popular wilderness destinations, victims who disappear without trace from campsites or hiking trails, and a complete absence of physical evidence despite intensive searches. We don't know if these cases represent other serial killers like Halloran, or if there are other explanations, but the statistical clustering is concerning. That conversation had taken place 3 weeks ago, and Kincaid had been unable to stop thinking about its implications since then. If there were 15 other Halloran-type predators operating in wilderness areas across the country, how many victims had they claimed? How long had they been operating undetected? And most importantly, how could law enforcement identify and stop them before more people died? These questions had no easy answers, but they had motivated Kincaid to develop new protocols for her department's handling of missing persons cases in wilderness areas. She had created a database that tracked not just individual disappearances, but also patterns across time and geography, looking for the kind of clustering that might indicate a predator operating in a specific territory. She had established closer coordination with the Forest Service, state police, and other agencies that operated in the coastal forests, ensuring that information about suspicious incidents or unusual observations was shared quickly and systematically. Deputy Torrance had become an advocate for expanded training on wilderness crime investigation, arguing that rural law enforcement needed specialized skills to recognize and respond to predators who used isolation and terrain as weapons. He had developed a presentation based on the Halloran case that he delivered to law enforcement agencies throughout Oregon, teaching officers to recognize the warning signs that might indicate serial predation in wilderness areas, unusual patterns of disappearances, suspicious individuals showing excessive interest in hikers and campers, and reports of people behaving in ways that suggested surveillance or stalking. But despite these efforts to prevent future cases, Kincaid knew that the fundamental problem remained unsolved. The same vast wilderness areas that made places like Cape Perpetua so appealing to visitors also made them ideal hunting grounds for predators who understood how to exploit isolation and terrain. Someone with Halloran's knowledge and determination could potentially operate for decades before being caught, taking victims who disappeared so completely that their cases were investigated as accidents or tragic instances of people getting lost, rather than as evidence of criminal activity. On a morning 2 weeks after standing at the Cape Perpetua overlook, Kincaid received a phone call that would demonstrate just how relevant these concerns remained. The call came from a ranger at Siuslaw National Forest, reporting that a camper at one of the more remote campgrounds had found something disturbing: a small notebook hidden in a hollowed-out tree stump near a popular hiking trail. The notebook contained observations about other campers in the area, written in a style that the ranger found reminiscent of the media coverage of Halloran's journals. Kincaid was at the location within an hour, accompanied by Deputy Torrance and a forensic investigator. The notebook was still where it had been found, carefully preserved as potential evidence. Kincaid photographed it in place before carefully removing it and examining the contents. What she read sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the morning fog that drifted through the trees around them. The handwriting was not Halloran's. The script was different, smaller, and more precise. But the content was eerily similar to Halloran's journals. Detailed observations of hikers and campers who had passed through the area, notes about their behavior and apparent attitudes toward the wilderness, and most disturbingly, a ranking system that classified people as either harmonious or disruptive, based on the observer's interpretation of their respect for nature. Several individuals marked as disruptive had additional notations suggesting they required correction or removal to protect the forest. "This is exactly how Halloran's journal started," Torrance said quietly, reading over Kincaid's shoulder. "Before she started killing people, she spent years just observing and documenting. Whoever wrote this is following the same pattern." He looked up at the surrounding forest, suddenly aware that they might be standing in territory claimed by another predator who believed murder was justified as environmental protection. Kincaid immediately expanded the investigation, interviewing everyone who had been camping in the area recently and searching for any individuals who matched the profile of someone who might be conducting surveillance on other visitors. She also ordered increased patrols in the area and established a tip line for anyone who noticed suspicious behavior in the national forest. But finding someone who didn't want to be found in thousands of acres of dense forest was extraordinarily difficult, even with dedicated resources and experienced personnel. Over the next several weeks, Kincaid's department received multiple reports of sightings that might be related to the notebook. A woman in her 40s seen observing a campground from a concealed position. An older man who approached hikers with warnings about their behavior being harmful to wildlife. Several reports of someone camping in areas where camping was prohibited. Each report was investigated, but none led to any solid identification of who had written the notebook or what their intentions might be. The situation came to a head when a family camping near the area where the notebook had been found reported that someone had approached their campsite after dark and delivered a lecture about proper wilderness etiquette before disappearing back into the forest. The family had been frightened by the encounter and had left the campground immediately, reporting the incident the next morning. The description they provided of their nighttime visitor was vague. Someone wearing dark clothing with their face partially obscured, speaking in a calm but intense voice about the sacred nature of the forest and the responsibility of visitors to minimize their impact. Kincaid recognized the pattern immediately. This was how Halloran had operated before escalating to violence, approaching campers with warnings and lectures that became increasingly threatening over time. The person behind the notebook and the nighttime visit was following the same trajectory, and if they weren't stopped soon, they would likely progress to actual violence, just as Halloran had done. The investigation intensified, with undercover officers posing as campers in the area and surveillance teams positioned at strategic locations throughout the forest. Kincaid also reached out to Agent Williams at the FBI, requesting assistance and sharing information about this potential new case. Williams responded immediately, sending a team of behavioral analysts who reviewed the notebook and provided a profile of the likely author, someone with significant wilderness experience, strong environmental convictions, social isolation, and a developing ideology that justified violence against those perceived as threats to nature. The profile matched Halloran so closely that it reinforced Kincaid's worst fears. There were indeed others out there who shared Halloran's twisted worldview and who might be following her path toward serial murder. The question was whether they could be identified and stopped before they claimed victims, or whether law enforcement would always be reacting to patterns that only became visible after multiple people had disappeared. 3 days after the family reported their nighttime encounter, one of the undercover officers stationed in the forest made contact with someone who appeared to match the profile. A man in his 50s camping alone in a remote area and displaying unusual interest in other campers had approached the officer with questions about why they had chosen to visit this particular area of the forest. The conversation had started casually but quickly became more intense, with the man expressing strong opinions about overcrowding in wilderness areas and the damage caused by people who didn't properly understand or respect natural environments. The undercover officer, trained to recognize warning signs based on the Halloran case, had carefully extracted himself from the conversation and reported the encounter. Surveillance was established on the man's campsite, and investigators began gathering information about his identity and background. What they discovered was troubling but not yet criminal. The man was named Gerald Finch, a retired biology teacher who had been living nomadically for the past 3 years, camping in various wilderness areas throughout Oregon and Northern California. He had no criminal record, but rangers at several locations remembered him as someone who frequently confronted other visitors about their behavior. Kincaid faced a difficult decision. Finch hadn't actually committed any crimes. Observing other campers wasn't illegal, and even the notebook entries, while disturbing, didn't constitute evidence of criminal intent. Approaching him openly might alert him to law enforcement interest and cause him to either flee or become more careful about concealing his activities. But not confronting him meant leaving him free to potentially escalate to violence if he followed Holloran's pattern. After consulting with prosecutors and the FBI, Kincaid made the decision to conduct a welfare check on Finch, using the pretense of ensuring he had proper permits for his extended camping stay. The contact would allow them to interview him, assess his mental state, and make clear that law enforcement was aware of his presence in the area. It was a calculated risk, but one that seemed justified given the potential danger if Finch was indeed developing into another Holloran. Kincaid and Deputy Torrance approached Finch's campsite the following morning, accompanied by a Forest Service ranger who provided official justification for the visit. Finch was cooking breakfast when they arrived, and his initial reaction to their presence was calm but wary. He confirmed his identity and explained that he was conducting personal research on forest ecology, documenting the impact of human visitation on wildlife patterns. When asked about the notebook that had been found, he initially denied any knowledge of it, but his body language suggested he was lying. "Mr. Finch, we're not here to harass you or interfere with your legitimate activities," Kincaid said carefully, maintaining a professional but firm tone. "But we are investigating suspicious activity in this area, and your name has come up in connection with that investigation. I need to ask you directly, have you been observing other campers and hikers in this forest? And if so, why?" Finch's calm demeanor cracked slightly, and for a moment Kincaid saw something in his eyes that reminded her uncomfortably of Holloran, a mixture of defensive anger and absolute conviction that his actions were justified. "People need to understand what they're doing to these places," Finch said, his voice rising slightly. "They come out here with their loud music and their trash and their complete disregard for the life that exists in these forests. Someone needs to educate them, to make them see the harm they're causing." "And how do you plan to do that education?" Kincaid asked, watching Finch carefully for his response. "By observing them without their knowledge? By approaching them at night to deliver lectures? What happens if they don't respond to your educational efforts, Mr. Finch? What then?" The question hung in the air between them, and Kincaid saw Finch processing it, realizing perhaps for the first time that his progression toward Holloran's methods was being recognized and challenged. His response, when it came, was defensive but also revealing. "I'm not Maeve Holloran, if that's what you're implying," he said. "I read about her case. What she did was wrong, but her underlying concern about protecting wilderness areas from destructive human behavior, that was valid. There has to be a way to address that concern without resorting to violence." It was the opening Kincaid had been hoping for, an acknowledgement that Finch saw himself as different from Holloran while also sharing her core ideology. She spent the next hour talking with Finch, carefully navigating between law enforcement authority and something closer to intervention, trying to pull him back from the path he was traveling before it led to irreversible actions. She explained how Holloran's convictions had led her to justify murder, how the isolation of living alone in the wilderness had allowed her worldview to become increasingly distorted and extreme, and how easy it would be for someone else to follow that same trajectory if they weren't careful. By the end of the conversation, Finch had admitted to writing the notebook, and to confronting the family at their campsite. He insisted he had never intended to harm anyone, and was genuinely shocked when Kincaid explained how his actions appeared from a law enforcement perspective, as the early stages of behavior that could escalate to violence. She arranged for Finch to speak with a counselor who specialized in working with people whose environmental concerns had become obsessive, and she made clear that continued surveillance would be maintained on his activities in the region. The encounter with Gerald Finch represented neither a complete success nor a failure. Kincaid had potentially prevented someone from following Holleran's path to serial murder, but she had also learned just how many people might be out there with similar ideologies and similar potential for violence. The Holleran case hadn't been an isolated aberration. It was an example of how extreme environmental ideology combined with isolation and mental instability could create killers who operated for decades before being caught. In the months that followed, Kincaid continued to balance her regular duties as sheriff with the expanded mission of identifying and monitoring potential threats in the coastal wilderness areas of Coos County. The Holleran case had fundamentally changed how she viewed her jurisdiction, transforming the beautiful forests and dramatic coastline from scenic backgrounds to potential hunting grounds that required constant vigilance. Deputy Torrance had taken on a leadership role in developing the department's Wilderness Crime Prevention Program, working with other agencies to create a network of information sharing and coordinated response that might prevent future predators from operating undetected. The program was still evolving, still learning from the mistakes that had allowed Holleran to kill for 30 years. But it represented progress toward addressing a problem that most law enforcement agencies had never even recognized existed. The 3 survivors from Holleran's cave had recovered physically from their ordeal, though the psychological scars would take much longer to heal. They had each given extensive interviews to law enforcement and mental health professionals, providing insights into Holleran's methods and mindset that helped inform prevention efforts. One of them had become an advocate for wilderness safety education, speaking to hiking and camping groups about situational awareness and the importance of reporting suspicious behavior to authorities. For Sheriff Arden Kincaid, the case remained a defining experience of her career, a reminder of both the capabilities and limitations of rural law enforcement. They had eventually caught Holleran and brought her to justice, but only after she had killed nearly 30 people over 3 decades. That delay represented a failure of the systems that should have recognized the pattern earlier, should have connected the dots between isolated incidents, should have questioned why so many people were disappearing from one relatively small area of coastline. On a foggy morning, 1 year after Holleran's arrest, Kincaid returned to the cave where the 3 survivors had been rescued, now sealed, and marked with a memorial plaque honoring all of Holleran's victims. She stood at the entrance, looking out over the coastal forest that stretched in all directions, and reflected on what the case had taught her about the nature of evil and the challenges of protecting people in vast, empty spaces. Evil didn't always announce itself with obvious violence or dramatic confrontation. Sometimes it grew slowly in isolation, feeding on ideology and justification until it became so normalized to the person harboring it that murder seemed not just acceptable but necessary. Maeve Holleran had spent 30 years killing people while believing she was performing a noble service, protecting something precious from those who would harm it. The tragedy was that her underlying concern, the need to protect wilderness areas from damage, was legitimate. What had gone wrong was her complete loss of perspective on the value of human life compared to environmental preservation. As Kincaid walked back through the forest toward her patrol vehicle, she passed hikers on the trail, families enjoying the natural beauty of the Oregon coast, children laughing and exploring with the joy of discovery. This was what the forests were meant to be, places where people could connect with nature, find peace, and create memories. Holleran's attempt to restrict these places to only those she deemed worthy had been fundamentally wrong, regardless of how she had justified it to herself. But Kincaid also knew that the wilderness would would always harbor dangers, both natural and human. People would continue to get lost, to fall from cliffs, to succumb to exposure. And occasionally, predators would emerge from the isolation to prey on the vulnerable. The best she could do was remain vigilant, learn from the patterns that past cases revealed, and work to identify threats before they could claim victims. The case files on Maeve Holleran would remain open for years, as more bodies were recovered and more victims identified. The investigation into potential similar cases in other wilderness areas would continue indefinitely, with law enforcement agencies across the country now alert to patterns they had previously overlooked. And in a maximum security prison cell in Oregon, Holleran herself would spend the rest of her life convinced that she had been right, that her mission had been noble, and that history would eventually vindicate her actions. Sheriff Arden Kincaid knew better. She had seen the faces of the survivors, heard the grief of the families, and walked through the places where Holleran had hidden her victims. There was no justification for what Holleran had done, no ideology that could make murder acceptable, no cause that was worth the destruction of so many lives. The forests would endure, with or without Holleran's twisted protection, and law enforcement would continue working to ensure that people could enjoy those forests without fear of the human predators who might be watching from the shadows. As she drove back toward Coquille, the fog began to lift from the coastal forests, revealing the stunning beauty of the landscape in the afternoon sun. Somewhere in those forests, the final victims of Maeve Holleran still lay in unmarked graves, waiting to be found and given the dignity of proper burial. The search would continue, the healing would proceed, and life in Coos County would gradually return to something resembling normal. But for Kincaid, nothing would ever be quite the same. Every fog-shrouded morning, every isolated campsite, every report of a missing hiker would carry echoes of the Holleran case, reminders that evil could wear the disguise of environmental concern, and that the most dangerous predators were often those who believed most completely in the righteousness of their actions. The wilderness remained beautiful, but it would never again seem quite as innocent as it had before she learned what monsters could hide in its empty spaces. Sheriff Harlan Vickery had spent 22 years patrolling the high desert of Deschutes County, Oregon, where sagebrush stretched to distant horizons and the wind carried the smell of juniper across landscapes that seemed unchanged since the last ice age retreated 10,000 years earlier. He knew every back road, every abandoned homestead, every place where teenagers went to drink and where criminals went to hide things they didn't want found. In all those years, he had built a reputation as a fair but uncompromising lawman who treated everyone the same regardless of their connections or status in the community. But he had never imagined that the most difficult case of his career would force him to investigate people he had trusted for years, or that the isolation of the high desert would conceal a conspiracy that reached into the heart of his own department. The call came in at 11:47 p.m. on a February night when a late winter storm was hammering the high desert with freezing rain and wind gusts that made driving treacherous on the best roads and nearly suicidal on the dirt tracks that connected remote properties. The caller was a truck driver who had pulled over on Highway 20 about 30 miles east of Bend to wait out the worst of the weather. He reported seeing what looked like an abandoned vehicle about a quarter mile off the highway, its headlights still on but no visible occupants. In normal conditions, it might have been nothing worth calling about, but in this weather, an abandoned vehicle with its lights on suggested someone might be in trouble and need help. Vickery took the call himself, partly because he was already on patrol in that area, and partly because the storm had kept most of his deputies off the roads unless absolutely necessary. At 54 years old, he was one of the most experienced drivers on his force, and he figured if anyone could safely navigate to the abandoned vehicle, it would be him. He radioed dispatch to let them know he was responding, then carefully turned his patrol vehicle toward the location the truck driver had described. The drive took nearly 20 minutes, even though the distance was only about 12 miles, because the freezing rain had turned the highway into a skating rink and visibility was reduced to whatever his headlights could illuminate through the curtain of precipitation. When he finally reached the approximate location, Vickery slowed to a crawl and began scanning the desert scrubland for any sign of vehicle lights. The truck driver's directions had been somewhat vague, about a quarter mile off the highway, somewhere near mile marker 47. And in this weather, distances and landmarks were difficult to judge. Then he saw them. 2 pinpoints of light cutting through the storm, positioned at an odd angle that suggested the vehicle had driven off the highway and into the desert but hadn't traveled very far before stopping. Vickery found a relatively safe place to pull over, activated his emergency lights, and retrieved his heavy-duty flashlight before stepping out into the brutal weather. The wind hit him like a physical force, and the freezing rain stung any exposed skin. He pulled his hood tighter and began making his way toward the distant lights, his boots crunching through the thin crust of ice that had formed over the sagebrush and volcanic rock. As he approached, Vickery could make out more details of the vehicle. A dark-colored SUV, probably a Ford Explorer or similar model, positioned nose down in a shallow ravine, as if it had simply driven straight off the highway and continued until momentum ran out. The headlights were still on, illuminating a patch of desert in front of the vehicle, and the engine was running, its exhaust creating clouds of steam that mixed with the freezing rain. But there was no sign of anyone inside or around the vehicle, which immediately struck Vickery as strange. Why would someone abandon a running vehicle with the lights on in the middle of a storm? He approached carefully, his hand resting on his service weapon as he swept the flashlight beam across the area around the SUV. The ground showed tire tracks leading from the highway to the vehicle's current position, and there were footprints in the ice-crusted mud leading away from the driver's side door. But the prints were already being obscured by the continuing storm, and Vickery couldn't determine how many people had been in the vehicle or where they might have gone. The driver's side door was unlocked, and Vickery opened it carefully, noting that the interior light came on and the vehicle appeared to be in good mechanical condition. The keys were still in the ignition, which was unusual but not unprecedented in situations where someone had fled a vehicle quickly. What was more concerning was what Vickery saw on the seats and dashboard. This wasn't an abandoned civilian vehicle. It was an unmarked law enforcement vehicle, and the equipment visible inside included a police radio, a laptop computer mounted on a stand, and a shotgun secured in a rack between the front seats. Vickery felt his pulse quicken as he processed this discovery. An unmarked police vehicle abandoned in the desert during a storm could mean an officer was in trouble, possibly injured and needing help. He immediately radioed dispatch, reporting his findings and requesting backup along with search and rescue resources. But even as he made that call, something about the scene bothered him. The vehicle was positioned deliberately rather than crashed. It had been driven into the ravine under control, not as a result of an accident, and there were no signs of struggle or violence inside the vehicle. Just the normal clutter of someone who spent a lot of time working from their car. While waiting for backup to arrive, Vickery conducted a more thorough examination of the vehicle, photographing everything with his phone and taking careful notes. The license plate check confirmed what he had suspected. This was a vehicle assigned to the Deschutes County Sheriff's Department, specifically designated as an undercover unit used for narcotics investigations. According to the records, it should have been checked out to Detective Ryan Holbrook, one of Vickery's senior investigators who specialized in drug cases. But Holbrook hadn't reported any problems, hadn't called for backup, and hadn't responded to multiple attempts to reach him on his radio or cell phone. Vickery's concern deepened into something approaching dread as he considered the implications. An experienced detective doesn't simply abandon his vehicle in the middle of nowhere during a storm without a very good reason. Either Holbrook was injured and unable to communicate, or something had happened that forced him to leave the vehicle quickly and without taking the time to call for help. The search of the vehicle's interior revealed several items that added to the puzzle without solving it. In the center console, Vickery found a small notebook containing what appeared to be surveillance notes, dates, times, locations, and descriptions of individuals and vehicles. The most recent entries were from earlier that evening and referenced a location about 15 miles from where the vehicle was now abandoned. There was also a manila envelope containing cash. Vickery counted it quickly and estimated approximately $5,000 in mixed bills. Drug buy money, almost certainly, which meant Holbrook had been working an active case and had been carrying the kind of money that made him a target for criminals. More disturbing was what Vickery found in the laptop computer after he powered it on. The most recent files opened were reports related to a drug investigation that had been ongoing for several months, targeting a methamphetamine distribution network operating in Central Oregon. Vickery was familiar with the case. Holbrook had been the lead investigator, working with several other detectives and with assistance from the Oregon State Police and DEA. The investigation had resulted in several arrests over the past year, but Holbrook had repeatedly expressed frustration that they were only catching low-level dealers, while the people running the operation remained frustratingly out of reach. What caught Vickery's attention was a document that appeared to have been created just hours earlier. A summary report that Holbrook had apparently been preparing but hadn't yet submitted through official channels. The report detailed surveillance conducted over the previous 2 weeks and included a list of suspects and persons of interest. Several names on the list were familiar to Vickery as people who had already been arrested and were awaiting trial. But 3 names near the bottom of the list made his blood run cold. Deputy Marcus Ashford, Dispatch Supervisor Linda Brennan, and Evidence Technician Thomas Keller, all employees of the Deschutes County Sheriff's Department. Vickery read the report carefully, his mind racing to process what he was seeing. According to Holbrook's notes, these 3 department employees had been observed meeting with known drug dealers at locations and times that suggested they weren't conducting official law enforcement business. Holbrook had documented vehicle movements, photographed meetings, and even recorded snippets of conversations that suggested the employees were receiving payments in exchange for information about ongoing investigations. The report concluded with Holbrook's assessment that the department had been compromised from within, and that the drug organization they were investigating had been successfully staying ahead of law enforcement because they were receiving advance warning about raids, surveillance operations, and arrest warrants. The implications were staggering. If Holbrook's suspicions were correct, then 3 people Vickery had trusted and worked with for years were actively betraying the department and facilitating drug trafficking in the county. And if Holbrook had discovered this conspiracy, then his disappearance tonight might not be coincidental. He might have been silenced by people who had everything to lose if his investigation became public. Backup units began arriving within 30 minutes, their emergency lights creating a surreal light show in the continuing storm. Vickery briefed the responding deputies on what he had found, but was careful about what information he shared, suddenly aware that he couldn't completely trust anyone in the department until he knew the full scope of the conspiracy Holbrook had been investigating. He ordered the vehicle secured as a crime scene and organized a search pattern to look for any sign of a Holbrook in the surrounding area. The search continued through the night and into the following morning, hampered by the storm and the vast emptiness of the high desert. Dozens of personnel combed the area around the abandoned vehicle, calling Holbrook's name and looking for any trace of where he might have gone. Search dogs were brought in once the weather improved enough for them to work, but the storm had obliterated most scent trails, and the dogs could establish no clear direction of travel from the vehicle. As the sun rose over the desert, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber, Vickery made the difficult decision to expand the investigation beyond just a search for a missing officer. He contacted the Oregon State Police and requested that their Internal Affairs Division send investigators to review Holbrook's allegations about corruption within the Sheriff's Department. He also quietly began his own investigation, carefully reviewing duty rosters, dispatch records, and evidence logs to see if he could find patterns that might support or refute Holbrook's suspicions. What he found was subtle, but damning. Over the past 18 months, there had been numerous instances where drug raids had found locations empty, despite intelligence suggesting active operations. Surveillance targets had changed their routines or moved to new locations just days before planned arrests. Defense attorneys had raised questions about the handling of evidence in several cases, suggesting someone had tampered with or compromised material evidence. Individually, these incidents could be explained as bad luck, poor intelligence, or simple mistakes. But when viewed as a pattern, especially through the lens of Holbrook's allegations, they painted a picture of systematic sabotage. Vickery pulled the personnel files for Ashford, Brennan, and Keller, looking for anything that might explain why they would betray the department. Marcus Ashford was a 32-year-old deputy with 8 years of service, good performance reviews, and no obvious financial problems. But digging deeper, Vickery discovered that Ashford's wife had medical bills from a cancer treatment that had left them with significant debt despite insurance coverage. Linda Brennan was 50 years old and had worked as a dispatcher for 15 years. She lived modestly, but Vickery learned she was supporting an adult son who had his own drug addiction problems. Thomas Keller was 28, had been with the department for 5 years, and appeared to live beyond his means based on his salary, expensive car, regular vacations, and a lifestyle that suggested income from sources other than his evidence technician position. Each of them had reasons they might be vulnerable to corruption, but Vickery knew that financial pressure alone didn't make someone a criminal. He needed more concrete evidence before he could move against them, and he needed to ensure that any investigation was conducted carefully enough that if they were guilty, they wouldn't have time to destroy evidence or flee before being arrested. 2 days after Holbrook's vehicle was discovered, Vickery's investigation received an unexpected break. Otis Wren, a mechanic who operated a small repair shop on the outskirts of Bend, called the Sheriff's Department and asked to speak with Vickery specifically. Wren explained that he had been following the news coverage of Detective Holbrook's disappearance and had information that might be relevant to the investigation. Vickery met Wren at his shop, a modest operation that serviced vehicles for both civilian and law enforcement customers. Wren was a weathered man in his 60s who had lived in Deschutes County his entire life and had a reputation as both a skilled mechanic and someone who minded his own business. The fact that he was voluntarily contacting law enforcement suggested he considered the information important enough to overcome his natural reticence. "Sheriff, I don't like getting involved in things that aren't my business," Wren began, his discomfort obvious. "But I've been thinking about something I saw a few days ago, and after hearing about your missing detective, I figure I need to tell somebody." He gestured toward his workspace where several vehicles were in various states of repair. "I service vehicles for your department sometimes, and about a week ago, Deputy Ashford brought in his personal truck for some work. While I was working on it, I found something wedged under the seat that he must have dropped. A prepaid cell phone, still in the package." Vickery felt his pulse quicken. Prepaid phones were commonly used by criminals and people who wanted to communicate without creating records that could be traced back to them. "Did you mention this to Deputy Ashford?" he asked. Wren shook his head. "Didn't think much of it at first. People buy those phones for all kinds of reasons. But I put it in my office safe to give back to him next time I saw him, and then I got curious and turned it on to make sure it still worked." He paused, clearly uncomfortable with what he was about to reveal. "Sheriff, that phone had been used to make dozens of calls over the past few months. I didn't listen to any messages or anything, but I could see the call logs, and some of the numbers it had been calling. Well, I recognized a couple of them because I'd seen them in news reports about drug arrests. This was the concrete evidence Vickery needed to move forward with the investigation. He seized the phone as evidence and obtained a warrant to examine its contents and track its usage patterns. The forensic analysis revealed exactly what he feared. The prepaid phone had been used to make calls to known drug dealers immediately before several planned raids, providing enough advance warning for the criminals to clear out before law enforcement arrived. The phone had also received calls from another prepaid number that investigators were able to trace to Linda Brennan's home address through cell tower records. Armed with this evidence and the information from Holbrook's abandoned vehicle, Vickery coordinated with Oregon State Police internal affairs investigators to build cases against Ashford, Brennan, and Keller. The investigation had to be conducted with absolute secrecy. If the suspects learned they were under investigation, they would likely destroy evidence and might flee the jurisdiction. Vickery also had to consider the possibility that there were other corrupt employees in the department beyond the 3 Holbrook had identified. The operation to arrest the 3 suspects was planned with military precision and executed simultaneously on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after Holbrook's disappearance. State police investigators arrested Marcus Ashford at his home as he was preparing to leave for his shift. Linda Brennan was taken into custody at the dispatch center by investigators who had been positioned there in advance. Thomas Keller was arrested in the evidence room where he worked, prevented from accessing any materials that might be destroyed. The arrests sent shockwaves through the sheriff's department and the wider law enforcement community in Central Oregon. The idea that trusted employees had been systematically betraying the department and facilitating drug trafficking was difficult for many to accept. But the evidence was overwhelming. Searches of the suspects' homes and vehicles revealed additional prepaid phones, records of cash payments, and in Keller's case, actual drugs that he had stolen from the evidence room and presumably sold or traded. But the arrests raised as many questions as they answered. Most significantly, what had happened to Detective Holbrook? The 3 arrested employees all denied any knowledge of Holbrook's disappearance and insisted they had nothing to do with whatever had happened to him. Their attorneys argued that even if their clients had been involved in corruption, there was no evidence linking them to any violence against Holbrook. Vickery wasn't convinced by these denials. The timing was too suspicious. Holbrook had been investigating the corruption and had documented evidence against the 3 employees, and then he had disappeared under circumstances that suggested foul play. But without Holbrook's body or any direct evidence of violence, prosecutors were reluctant to add murder or kidnapping charges to the corruption case. The break in the case came from an unexpected source. Darla Fenwick, a reporter for the Bend Bulletin who had been covering the corruption scandal, received an anonymous tip directing her to a specific location in the desert about 40 miles from where Holbrook's vehicle had been found. The tipster claimed that something related to the missing detective could be found there. Fenwick contacted Vickery before going to the location herself, recognizing that if the tip was legitimate, it might be a crime scene that needed to be preserved. Vickery assembled a team and traveled to the coordinates provided by the anonymous tipster. The location was a remote area of Bureau of Land Management land, accessible only by rough 4-wheel drive roads and rarely visited except by occasional hunters or rock collectors. What they found there explained much about Holbrook's disappearance and added a terrible finality to the investigation. In a shallow ravine concealed by juniper trees, searchers found Detective Ryan Holbrook's body. He had been shot twice, and based on the condition of the remains and the crime scene evidence, he had been dead since the night his vehicle was found. The murder had been committed with careful planning. Holbrook had been lured to this remote location, executed, and hastily buried in a location where he might have remained undiscovered for years, if not for the anonymous tip. The forensic investigation of the crime scene provided crucial evidence. Tire tracks found near the burial site matched the tread pattern of a vehicle owned by Thomas Keller. Ballistics analysis of the bullets recovered from Holbrook's body matched a weapon that had been reported stolen from the sheriff's department evidence room months earlier, a theft that Keller, as evidence technician, would have been in a perfect position to commit. Cell phone records showed that Ashford, Brennan, and Keller had all been in communication on the night of Holbrook's disappearance, despite having no official reason to be coordinating with each other. Most damning was evidence found during a more thorough search of Ashford's property. A storage unit he had rented under a false name contained items belonging to Holbrook, including his badge, service weapon, and personal effects that had been missing from the abandoned vehicle. The items appeared to have been kept as insurance, something Ashford could use to prove his role in eliminating the threat Holbrook represented to the conspiracy. With this evidence, prosecutors were able to charge all 3 suspects with conspiracy to commit murder, and Marcus Ashford was additionally charged with first-degree murder for his direct role in killing Holbrook. The investigation revealed that when Holbrook had gotten too close to exposing their activities, the 3 conspirators had decided he needed to be eliminated. They had used their insider knowledge to track his movements, and Ashford had arranged a meeting with Holbrook under the pretense of providing information about the drug organization. Instead, he had lured Holbrook to the remote location where he was killed. The trials that followed drew enormous public attention, with each day bringing new revelations about the depth of corruption within the sheriff's department and the drug organization that had been operating with their assistance. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of a conspiracy that had compromised dozens of investigations over 18 months and had ultimately resulted in the murder of a dedicated detective who had gotten too close to the truth. Marcus Ashford was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy and sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. Linda Brennan and Thomas Keller were convicted of conspiracy to commit murder, corruption, and numerous other charges related to their betrayal of the department. They each received sentences of 30 years in prison. For Sheriff Harlan Vickery, the case represented both a professional success in bringing the conspirators to justice and a personal failure in not recognizing the corruption within his own department sooner. He had trusted these employees, had worked alongside them for years, and had never suspected that they were capable of such betrayal. The fact that Detective Holbrook had died while investigating corruption that Vickery himself should have detected was a burden that would weigh on him for the rest of his career. In the aftermath of the trials, Vickery implemented sweeping reforms within the sheriff's department, including enhanced internal oversight, regular audits of evidence handling procedures, and improved psychological screening for employees with access to sensitive information. He also established a confidential reporting system that allowed employees to report concerns about corruption or misconduct without fear of retaliation. The anonymous tipster who had directed reporter Darla Fenwick to Holbrook's burial site was never identified. Speculation suggested it might have been someone else within the drug organization who had been disturbed by the murder and wanted to see justice done, or possibly someone within the department who had suspected the corruption but had been too afraid to come forward until after the arrests. Whoever they were, their decision to provide that crucial information had ensured that Holbrook's killers faced justice and that his family had closure. 6 months after the trials concluded, Vickery stood in the high desert where Holbrook's vehicle had been found, watching the sun set over the distant Cascade Mountains. The landscape looked exactly as it always had, vast, empty, and seemingly eternal. But Vickery knew that beneath the surface, the high desert held secrets, and the isolation that made this country beautiful also made it dangerous for those who trusted the wrong people. Detective Ryan Holbrook's name was added to a memorial honoring law enforcement officers killed in the line of duty, a recognition of his sacrifice and his dedication to exposing corruption even when it cost him his life. The case had revealed uncomfortable truths about how even trusted institutions could be compromised by people willing to betray their oaths for money or other incentives. For the residents of Deschutes County, the scandal was a reminder that corruption could exist anywhere, even in the departments tasked with protecting them. But it was also a demonstration that when corruption was exposed, the justice system could hold the guilty accountable regardless of their positions or connections. As Vickery drove back toward Bend that evening, passing through the desert landscape he had patrolled for more than 2 decades, he reflected on what the case had taught him about trust, betrayal, and the price of vigilance. Evil didn't always come from outside the community or from obvious criminals. Sometimes it grew from within, fed by financial pressure, moral weakness, or simply the gradual erosion of principles that happened when people convinced themselves that small compromises wouldn't matter. The high desert would continue to attract those seeking isolation, those running from something, and those hiding secrets they hoped would never be discovered. Sheriff Harlan Vickery would continue patrolling these empty spaces, now with a harder-won wisdom about human nature and a determination to ensure that the betrayal that had cost Detective Holbrook his life would never be allowed to take root in his department again. The wind swept across the sagebrush as a darkness fell, carrying with it the cold promise of another desert winter. Somewhere in that vast emptiness, other secrets might be waiting to be discovered. Other betrayals might be quietly unfolding. But Vickery had learned that vigilance required constant effort and that trust, once broken, could never be fully restored. The desert had taught him that lesson in the harshest way possible, and it was a lesson he would never forget. The weeks following the conclusion of the trials brought a strange quiet to the sheriff's department, as if the building itself was recovering from trauma. Employees who had worked alongside Ashford, Brennan, and Keller for years struggled to reconcile the colleagues they thought they knew with the criminals those people had proven to be. Some deputies requested transfers to other counties, unable to continue working in a department that had been so thoroughly compromised. Others threw themselves into their work with renewed dedication, as if they could somehow compensate for the betrayal by being more vigilant, more honest, more committed to the principles that should have protected them from corruption in the first place. Sheriff Vickery understood both reactions. There were mornings when he sat in his office before dawn, staring at the empty streets of Bend through his window and wondering if he should have seen the signs earlier. He replayed conversations with Ashford, reviewed decisions he had made about evidence handling procedures, questioned whether his leadership had somehow created the environment that allowed corruption to flourish. The rational part of his mind knew that sophisticated betrayal was designed to be invisible, that Ashford and his co-conspirators had been careful to maintain their cover stories and avoid obvious mistakes. But the emotional weight of responsibility didn't respond to rational arguments. Detective Holbrook's widow, Amanda, had attended every day of the trials, sitting in the front row of the courtroom and listening to the details of how her husband had been murdered by people who wore the same badge he had worn. Vickery had met with her several times after the verdicts, trying to provide what comfort he could and answering her questions about what the department would do to ensure this never happened again. During their last meeting, she had asked him a question that he still couldn't fully answer. "Sheriff, how long do you think Ryan knew he was in danger?" Amanda Holbrook had asked, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. When he was conducting that surveillance, documenting those meetings, building his case, did he know that the people he was investigating would kill him to keep their secret? Did he die knowing he was alone? That he couldn't trust anyone in the department because he didn't know how deep the corruption went? Vickery had wanted to tell her that Holbrook probably didn't realize the danger until it was too late, that his death had been quick and he hadn't suffered. But he knew she deserved honesty more than comfort. "I think Ryan knew he was taking a risk. he had said carefully. The fact that he documented everything so thoroughly, that he kept backup copies of his investigation files in multiple locations, that suggests he understood the danger. But I also think he believed that exposing the truth was worth the risk. He died doing what law enforcement officers are supposed to do, which is protect the integrity of the justice system even when it costs them personally. The answer hadn't satisfied Amanda Holbrook, and it hadn't satisfied Vickery either. The truth was that Detective Holbrook had died alone in the high desert, betrayed by people he should have been able to trust, and no amount of philosophical reflection could change that reality or make it more palatable. The reforms Vickery implemented in the aftermath were comprehensive, and sometimes met with resistance from employees who felt they were being punished for the actions of a few corrupt individuals. Random drug testing for all personnel with access to evidence or confidential information. Mandatory psychological evaluations conducted by outside professionals rather than department staff. A civilian oversight board with real authority to investigate complaints and review department operations. Body cameras for all deputies during all interactions with the public. Financial disclosure requirements for anyone working in sensitive positions. Some of the reforms were expensive, requiring budget increases that meant other programs had to be cut or delayed. Some created friction with the deputies union, which argued that the new policies treated all employees as if they were potential criminals. But Vickery pushed forward with all of them, knowing that the only way to restore public trust in the department was to demonstrate that corruption would never again be allowed to take root. 3 months after the trials, Vickery received a letter that would provide some context for the anonymous tip that had led to the discovery of Holbrook's body. The letter had been mailed from Seattle, postmarked 2 weeks earlier, and contained no return address. Inside was a single page of handwritten text, unsigned but clearly from someone with intimate knowledge of the drug organization that Ashford, Brennan, and Keller had been protecting. The letter explained that the tipster had been a mid-level dealer in the methamphetamine distribution network, someone who had benefited from the information provided by the corrupt deputies, but who had been horrified when he learned that Holbrook had been murdered. The writer claimed that murder had never been part of the arrangement, that the corrupt deputies were supposed to provide advance warning about raids and investigations, nothing more. When Ashford had killed Holbrook and then tried to recruit other members of the drug organization to help cover up the crime, several people in the network had realized they were dealing with someone far more dangerous than they had understood. I'm not writing this to make excuses or claim I'm innocent, the letter read in its conclusion. I know what I did was wrong, and I know people got hurt because of the drugs we sold. But killing a cop crosses a line that shouldn't be crossed, and I couldn't live with knowing where Detective Holbrook was buried and not telling someone. I'm getting out of the business and out of Oregon, trying to start over somewhere else. But I wanted you to know that not everyone involved in this was okay with what Ashford did. Some of us still have lines we won't cross. Vickery had the letter analyzed by forensic experts who confirmed that the handwriting matched samples obtained from one of the dealers who had been arrested during the larger investigation, but who had disappeared before trial after posting bail. The FBI was notified and a warrant was issued, but the letter writer was never found. Vickery kept the letter in his office safe, a reminder that even in the criminal world, there were gradations of moral compromise, and that sometimes justice came from unexpected sources. The physical landscape of Deschutes County remained unchanged by the scandal that had rocked its law enforcement community. The high desert continued to stretch toward distant horizons. The juniper trees grew and died according to patterns established millennia ago, and the wind carried the same scents it had always carried. But for Vickery, the meaning of that landscape had been altered. The isolation that had once seemed like a feature of the high desert's beauty now seemed like a vulnerability, a quality that allowed secrets to be hidden and crimes to be concealed. On his patrols through the empty spaces between small communities, Vickery found himself studying the landscape with new awareness. That abandoned homestead where teenagers gathered to drink, had it also been used by drug dealers to store or distribute their product? That rough four-wheel drive road, leading to nowhere in particular, had corrupt deputies used it to meet with their criminal contacts away from observation? The vast emptiness that made the high desert so appealing to those seeking escape from crowded cities also made it perfect for those seeking to escape from accountability. One evening, nearly 6 months after the trials, Vickery drove out to the location where Holbrook's vehicle had been found. The site had been thoroughly processed by forensic teams and had long since been released as a crime scene, but Vickery felt drawn to it, as if standing in the place where the betrayal had become undeniable might help him understand something he was still struggling to process. He parked his patrol vehicle on the highway shoulder and walked out into the desert, following the faint traces of tire tracks that were still visible despite months of wind and weather. The ravine where the SUV had been found looked unremarkable in the fading light, just another shallow depression in the volcanic rock and sagebrush that characterized this landscape. But Vickery could picture the scene as it must have been on that stormy February night. Holbrook's vehicle positioned deliberately rather than crashed. The headlights still on, the engine running, creating the impression of an accident or an emergency that required immediate response. It had been a trap, carefully set by people who knew exactly how law enforcement would respond to an abandoned police vehicle in dangerous weather. Ashford had been waiting nearby, probably concealed in the darkness beyond the reach of the vehicle's headlights. When Holbrook had approached to investigate his own abandoned vehicle, lured there by a fake emergency call that had come through channels Ashford controlled, he had been ambushed and forced into Ashford's vehicle at gunpoint. The whole thing had probably taken less than 5 minutes. Then Ashford had driven Holbrook 40 miles to the remote burial site, executed him with a weapon stolen from the evidence room, and hastily concealed the body before returning to his normal duties as if nothing had happened. The level of premeditation was chilling. This wasn't a crime of passion or an act of panic. It was a calculated murder designed to eliminate a threat to a profitable criminal enterprise. And it had been carried out by someone who had sworn an oath to protect and serve. Someone Vickery had trusted and worked alongside for years. As darkness settled over the high desert and the first stars became visible in the clear sky, Vickery stood beside the ravine and allowed himself to feel the full weight of what had happened. A good man had died because Vickery's department had been compromised. Families throughout Deschutes County had been affected by drugs that should have been intercepted but weren't, because corrupt employees provided advance warning. The justice system itself had been damaged by the revelation that people sworn to uphold it had instead undermined it for profit. But standing in that empty desert, Vickery also felt something else. A renewed sense of purpose. The betrayal had been profound, but the response to that betrayal would define what the sheriff's department became in its aftermath. They could allow the corruption to be the final word, could let cynicism and distrust poison the organization permanently. Or they could use the painful lessons learned to build something stronger, more accountable, and more worthy of public trust. The drive back to Bend took nearly an hour, and Vickery used that time to think about the future rather than dwelling on the past. Detective Holbrook couldn't be brought back, and the damage done by Ashford, Brennan, and Keller couldn't be undone. But the department could honor Holbrook's memory by ensuring that his sacrifice meant something, that the corruption he had exposed led to lasting change rather than temporary reforms that faded once public attention moved on to other stories. When Vickery finally pulled into the parking lot of the sheriff's department headquarters, he sat in his vehicle for a few minutes before going inside, looking at the building where he had worked for more than 2 decades. The structure itself was unremarkable. A low-slung concrete and steel building that could have housed any government agency or commercial operation. But what happened inside that building mattered. The decisions made there, the standards upheld there, the integrity maintained there. All of it affected people's lives in ways both obvious and subtle. Vickery had always understood that intellectually, but now he understood it viscerally, in a way that came from having witnessed the consequences when those standards and that integrity were compromised. Every decision he made as sheriff, every person he hired, every policy he implemented, all of it mattered because corruption wasn't an abstract concept. It had a name and a face. It had left a widow and fatherless children. It had cost a dedicated detective his life. As he finally entered the building and walked through the quiet halls toward his office, Vickery noticed something he hadn't paid attention to before. On the wall near the entrance was a plaque listing the names of Deschutes County law enforcement officers who had died in the line of duty. The list was mercifully short. The high desert might be dangerous terrain, but it didn't produce the kind of violence that claimed officers' lives with any regularity. But recently a new name had been added to that plaque. Detective Ryan Holbrook. Vickery stopped and stood before the memorial, reading Holbrook's name and the dates that bracketed his too-short life. 42 years old when he died, married, 2 children, 14 years of service to the department. The bare facts told nothing about the man himself. His dedication, his frustration with corruption, his determination to expose wrongdoing even when it put him at risk. But the memorial stood as a reminder to everyone who entered this building that the work they did mattered, and that sometimes it cost more than anyone should have to pay. In his office, Vickery found a stack of reports waiting for his review. Budget proposals, personnel evaluations, policy recommendations, all the routine paperwork that consumed so much of a sheriff's time. He settled into his chair and began working through the stack, but found his mind wandering back to the questions that had haunted him for months. Could he have prevented what happened? If he had been more suspicious, more vigilant, more willing to believe that corruption could exist within his own department, would Detective Holbrook still be alive? The rational answer was probably not. Ashford and his co-conspirators had been careful and had taken advantage of the trust that should naturally exist between colleagues. But rationality provided cold comfort when measured against the consequences of missing the warning signs. What Vickery had learned, painfully and at great cost, was that trust could not be absolute even within a law enforcement organization. The reforms he had implemented, the random drug testing, the financial disclosures, the civilian oversight, all of them represented a recognition that good intentions weren't enough. Systems needed to be in place to detect corruption before it metastasized into something that cost lives. Some of his deputies resented those systems, viewing them as evidence that Vickery no longer trusted his own people. But Vickery had come to understand that trust and verification weren't opposites. They were complementary parts of a healthy organization. He could trust that most of his employees were honest and dedicated, while also verifying through systematic oversight that the few who weren't could be identified and removed before they caused catastrophic damage. The night deepened outside his office window, and the streets of Bend grew quiet as businesses closed and residents settled into their homes. Vickery continued working through his paperwork, but part of his attention remained focused on the larger questions that had no easy answers. How did you prevent betrayal? How did you maintain trust while acknowledging that some people would abuse that trust? How did you honor the memory of someone who had died exposing corruption by ensuring that their death led to meaningful change? He didn't have complete answers to any of those questions, but he had learned something fundamental about leadership in the aftermath of the scandal, that it required both strength and humility. Strength to make difficult decisions and implement unpopular reforms. Humility to acknowledge that no leader could prevent all wrongdoing or protect everyone under their responsibility. As midnight approached, Vickery finally finished his paperwork and prepared to head home. Before leaving, he walked once more through the quiet building, checking doors and observing the dispatch center where night shift personnel monitored radio traffic and responded to calls. Everything appeared routine, professional, exactly as it should be. But Vickery knew that appearances could be deceiving, that routine could conceal rot, and that professional demeanor could mask criminal intent. He stepped outside into the cold desert night, feeling the wind that never seemed to completely stop in this high country. Somewhere out in that vast darkness, the high desert stretched for hundreds of miles, holding whatever secrets it had always held. Some of those secrets were innocent, the private lives of ranchers and small-town residents who valued their solitude. Others were darker, the hidden activities of criminals who used the emptiness as cover for their operations. Sheriff Harlan Vickery would continue patrolling those empty spaces, investigating those secrets, and trying to maintain order in a landscape that seemed designed to resist it. The corruption scandal had changed him, had taught him lessons he wished he hadn't needed to learn. But it had also strengthened his resolve to ensure that the department he led was worthy of the trust placed in it by the community it served. Detective Ryan Holbrook had died defending that principle. The least Vickery could do was spend the rest of his career honoring that sacrifice by building a department where betrayal would be detected before it could claim more lives, where corruption would find no fertile ground, and where the oath sworn by every deputy meant something more than empty words. The wind swept across the high desert as Vickery drove toward home, carrying with it the smell of sage and juniper, and the promise of another cold night under stars that had witnessed human drama for thousands of years. The landscape remained indifferent to that drama, unchanging and eternal in its vast emptiness. But the people who lived and worked in that landscape had changed. They had learned that trust required vigilance, that integrity demanded constant effort, and that the price of betrayal was measured not just in careers and convictions, but in lives destroyed and families shattered. Somewhere in the maximum security prison where Marcus Ashford would spend the rest of his life, the former deputy was probably reflecting on the choices that had led him there. But Vickery didn't waste time thinking about Ashford or his co-conspirators. His focus was on the future, on the department he was rebuilding, on the officers who were learning from the scandal and committing themselves to something better. The high desert would always hold secrets. That was its nature. But Sheriff Vickery had learned that some secrets couldn't be allowed to remain hidden, that some betrayals demanded exposure regardless of the cost. Detective Holbrook had understood that, had paid the ultimate price for that understanding, and Vickery would spend the rest of his career ensuring that the desert's empty spaces, for all their isolation and all their potential for concealment, could never again hide the kind of corruption that had taken his detective's life and shaken his department to its foundation.